that feedback they got from the market and make some slight changes, but it probably won't be significant.
Interesting. I mean, so how is the forward calendar building up, though? Are you seeing some, more issuers trying to feel around for interest, or is even that kind of a bit dead?
It's a pretty interesting time in munis. The summer is typically somewhat quiet, but this summer has been unusually busy. There's a couple reasons for that. I think there's a lot of kind of cash on the sidelines that investors are getting as bonds kind of start to mature, and they're thinking about putting that back into the market. Issuance has been really strong this year. We're up, I think, 35, 36% year over year. And there is this kind of sentiment among issuers who are watching the election, and there's so much uncertainty about which way it's going to go. There's some who just want to get out ahead of it because there could be some big changes to A, yields, and B, just tax treatment of munis in general. I think issuers like knowing what kind of market they're going to be selling bonds into, and they would rather get these bonds to market ahead of the election.
All right, so remind me what the risk is in terms of taxes and munis in the election under President Trump?
So Trump has not made any specific claims about this, but there is kind of a fear in the market that there may be some cuts or changes to the muni tax exemption. That would be a massive, massive impact to the market and something investors talk a lot about, but he hasn't made any really specific claims about that. And then I think the other is just, some investors I talk to think no matter which way the election goes, just given the way the deficit is growing, there is going to have to be an increase in taxes at some point. And that actually makes munis more valuable because there's a really valuable way to, help shield your income from taxes.
Oh, that's a good one, because you can see that the tax exemption is the thing that is such an important driver. Are there any particular sectors in Muniland that are particularly worth watching with regard to this risk about the tax exemption, like, for example, education?
We have written about some of the just general pressure that we've seen in Congress. A lot of Republican congressmen have kind of talked about changes to the tax exemption, specifically in the context of really elite schools like Harvard. We wrote a story about that a couple weeks ago. And then other sectors, we've been paying close attention to Florida. They've been issuing a lot of bonds, just like double year over year, and vastly outpacing some of the significant issuance we've seen generally in the market. There's just a ton of really rich people moving to Florida. The population is surging, and that's putting some strain on the infrastructure there. They need to build new water systems, new roads, build bigger schools. And so that has really been a point of interest for us, all this massive issuance we're seeing coming out of Florida.
All right, Nick, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Nick Carello joining us, Bloomberg Municipal Finance Reporter. Let's go back to that breaking news from the top of the hour. Cisco, that stock is down by about 1%. Reuters saying that Cisco will cut thousands of jobs in new layoff round. We want to go to Woo Jin Ho, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst. Woo, is this expected?
No, it wasn't expected. As a matter of fact, they had their analyst day a couple of months ago, and they stuck to their guidance. But quite frankly, when they made the first round of cuts, I didn't think they cut enough. And I think they're finally right-sizing the business.
So, looking at that point, you think that they may not have cut enough. What's the problem there? Is the problem that the overall environment has changed, or is this a management problem that they are not giving a correct assessment of what their needs are?
Yeah, so the first round of cuts, it was only about 5% of the headcount. When they made those cuts, I thought they should have done about, 10 to 15% cuts at the first time around, primarily to that point that the environment has been so weak. Now, fiscal 2025 is going to be a transition year. That's number one. And number two, if you recall, they had that Splunk deal, and that took on a lot of excess cost. So I thought they needed to make an additional round, and this is making them step towards operating margin expansion next year.
So take me into the business model for Cisco. We haven't confirmed how big these cuts are going to be or where they're going to come, but where do you think they should be, and where do you think the cuts should come from?
Yeah, so the reports are saying roughly about 4,000 from a headcount perspective. That's going to be roughly about $600 to $850 million in operating expenses, and that's about 100 basis points in gross margin expansion. Look, there are two businesses, right? Their growthy business, which is more on the software side, plus security and observability. That's supposed to be mid-teens growth. It's not going anywhere, right? If anything, they're probably going to double down on that business to continue to drive growth. Where the weakness is their core traditional networking business, which is going to be down for the year. I suspect that some of the legacy mature businesses are going to be pared back.
What's the prospect for either of those key business lines to turn around? I mean, is there a problem ahead with demand? Is there some fundamental technical problem? Or is it just people are getting waylaid by the need to spend on AI?
Yeah, so from the networking front, there was a lot of upfront buying over the past year, and they're still going through that excess capacity, they're slowly getting through it. It's probably not going as quickly as they had hoped, but it's probably going to be another 2 quarters or so before we start seeing organic growth again in those businesses. Look, at the end of the day, we're still talking about 0 to 5% growth, not stellar growth here. So you're going to right size those businesses to reflect the growth for the longer term growth.
What kind of AI stuff does Cisco have going on for it?
They actually have a lot of cool AI stuff. They have about $1 billion in orders. But look, at the end of the day, Alex, $1 billion in order on a $51 to $55 billion company, that's only a drop in the bucket. So they need a lot more AI. So they're not like a server business where they're delivering about $7 billion a year in server revenues. They're doing cool stuff, but it'll take time for real software type of businesses to materialize.
I mean, I wonder how patient stock investors are going to be. No one wants to hear a story that it's going to take time, especially in this environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at how the stock has moved from the peak to where the trough is, you're playing for dividends right now, and at almost a 4% dividend yield. We'll see. Maybe they are looking for the preservation of profitability, dividend, and dividend growth over the longer term.
All right, Wooj, really appreciate Woo Jin Ho, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst, joining us on those reports that Cisco could cut thousands of jobs in a new layoff round. Coming up, we're going to get more take on the market. It doesn't feel like anyone wants to take on risk into the weekend. So then how do you set yourself up for the next couple weeks of August, particularly when you have Jackson Hole and NVIDIA? And next week is CPI and retail earnings. So there still is stuff going on. We're going to talk to Erica Maschmeyer. She's portfolio manager at Columbia Threadneedle on her outlook for the markets. To kind of check in here to make sure we are still pretty much flat on the day. The Dow's flat, the Nasdaq's flat, the S&P is up 0.1%. Let's get your world and national news now. Here is John Tucker. John?
All right, Alex and Jen, a tornado watch in effect for counties in New Jersey and New York State west of Manhattan until 2 o'clock. This is the remains of Tropical Storm Debbie. March north after drenching parts of the south. Potentially dangerous flooding expected from Washington, D.C. all the way north to Boston. One tornado touched down near Wilmington, Delaware last night. Busy presidential campaign day. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are hosting an event in Glendale, Arizona today. Well, Donald Trump leads a rally in Bozeman, Montana. Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, in Michigan yesterday spoke to the UAW.
We're not falling for these folks who are trying to divide us, trying to separate us.
And after holding no public campaign event this week, Donald Trump spoke with reporters at his Mar-a-Lago resort, criticizing Harris's intelligence and claiming she's avoiding reporters.
She doesn't know how to do a news conference. She's not smart enough to do a news conference.
Trump taking questions for about an hour on a range of issues, insisting Republicans have the momentum in this race. Ukraine says it carried out a drone strike on a military airfield in Russia's western region, expanding the reach of its assaults on Russian territory for a 4th day. The attack hitting a facility at an airfield storing glide bombs that Russia uses to target Ukrainian troops and cities. The fighting continued for a 4th day in the neighboring Kursk region of Russia, following the surprise incursion by as many as 1,000 Ukrainian troops backed by tanks and other armored vehicles. And an earthquake off the coast of Japan's southern island prompted the government to issue its first ever warning for a megaquake from an undersea trough running along a swath of the country's coast. The Prime Minister called off a planned trip to Central Asia out of an abundance of caution following the warning. Global news, 24 hours a day, whenever you want it. Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A little change right now on the S&P 500 index. Higher, barely, up by just under 1/10%. The S&P right now higher by 5 points. We have got the Dow in the red now, down 18, a decline of just under 1/10%. The Nasdaq Composite Index just about flat on the day. Nasdaq now lower by 3 points. A little change there. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares down by about 0.4%. 10-year at 3.93%, the 2-year 4.01%. Spot gold up 0.1%, 24.29 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.6%, 76.64 for a barrel of WTI. A wild week for markets, wrapping up with subdued action in stocks as traders do remain cautious after a historic surge in volatility. Forecasters say Federal Reserve easing is imminent, but it could disappoint some on Wall Street. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
There had been calls for a jumbo Fed rate cut after July's unemployment rate set a 3-year high. Economists surveyed by Bloomberg anticipate modest action when the Fed meets in mid-September, a quarter-point reduction followed by similar moves into early 2025. That suggests the situation doesn't seem dire enough to warrant a monetary jolt. Officials have held rates at a more than 2-decade high since last July, and inflation now appears to be moderating. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Paramount Global, the parent of Nickelodeon, MTV, and other channels, has taken a second quarter impairment charge of almost $6 billion on its cable networks. Yet another sign of weakness in the traditional TV industry. Paramount Global up today by 0.7%. And our top story, Cisco Systems plans to cut thousands more jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. This, according to Reuters. Shares of Cisco Systems, they're down now by 1.1%. Recapping, stocks trading mixed. S&P up 5, a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so very much. I'm Alex Steele alongside Jen Ryan. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you the top news in business, economics, and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence team. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. Paul Sweeney is off sunning himself. It's actually a little lighter out. I don't think it's raining.
I know.
He is at the beach.
I don't know. I can't really see some blue sky from here, but I don't think I could anyway.
Yeah,
so.
no, fair enough. Right. Well, Jen and I are here. We are holding down the fort. It was a week. Obviously, a week that was. Here's some stats for you. The S&P is falling now for 4 straight weeks, longest streak since September of 2023. NASDAQ 100 down 5 weeks, worst streak since May of 2022. A real divide happening within tech and the have and have-nots. Akamai Technology, the best performing stock on the S&P, up by almost 10%, and Intel, one of the worst, down by about 4%. Obviously, Cisco in the crosshairs there with those reports of layoffs of thousands in a second job round. What do you do? How much risk do you take on? Erica Maschmeyer is portfolio manager at Columbia Threadneedle Investments. She joins us now from Chicago, Illinois. Erica, how much risk should one have on right now?
I think we are still in a place where you benefit from having a relatively balanced portfolio, profitable companies with good competitive positions growing. That said, historically, when the VIX has been high, it has been a good time to start to layer on risk. And I think you can do that in a couple of different ways, right? Through pure growth companies, software companies that have been more ignored at the expense of AI hardware, and then also with more cyclical construction, housing related names.
But before this market craziness started this week, I mean, the market was already looking really quite frothy. So it's been a dip for sure, but has it been enough of a dip that some of that froth has been removed and there's really some decent room for people to get in?
Well, I think the froth was really more on the mega caps, right? The part of the market that admittedly is the biggest part of the market and is larger than many countries, but it was a pretty bifurcated market. There was an easy trade, right? The easy trade was buy U.S. large cap tech and short everything else out there. We started to see that dispersion pick up last quarter. which I think is fair because we had earnings potentially decelerating for that group. I think a lot of the outperformance was fair because the large cap stocks were growing faster, but there are more cracks in that, and I think that there are plenty of areas that don't have froth at all.
What do you buy then? If there's no froth, we kind of been through it. Maybe the rotation into, say, SMIDs is still up for grabs. I mean, the Russell has underperformed and then / outperformed when we had the sell-off over the last couple days, but nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I think the valuation advantage for small caps has small mid has been there for a while, right? The table's been set for a while for there to be a rotation there. It hasn't happened for good reasons, right? You need, I think, a macro to be steady, and you need the earnings growth. We have been living through this choppier macro. From our team's been paying attention to the economy from a rolling recession perspective ever since we had COVID, which led to big booms and busts. So, from here, we think that in small mid software, there are some interesting names. That's a group that has been more ignored at the expense of AI hardware areas. They've, admittedly had some weaker sales cycles because the CFOs of the world are looking to get rid of software at this point and not add more. But I think that we're going to hit the point where there are a lot of these companies that are adding real value and growing. We own Zeta Global, which is a small cap stock that is actually up over 160% year to date, but is still relatively cheap versus other software names. I think at the same time, you have pretty much anything short cycle manufacturing, industrial construction that has a lot of opportunity and potential for upside as we start to get rate cuts. We own Top Build, which is a company that is an insulation distributor and supplier, and they just reported this week. It's still a relatively inexpensive stock. They missed slightly, gave a slightly worse guidance range, but stock got hit. But this is one they'll continue to take share, executing very well. And as soon as we get rate cuts, some of these projects that have been delayed will start to actually happen.
I did want to ask you about rate cuts because you're mentioning a number of sectors that have been overlooked and could benefit from rate cuts. But how big a rate cut do they need at this point? Is 25 basis points going to be the start of a firing gun that gets things moving again? Or do they need the 50 basis points that some big players have been calling for?
I don't think that we need a 50 basis point cut. And frankly, I think it's low probability. And I think if that happened, it would be more likely to spook the market from a macro perspective, right? The Fed only does that when you have something really, really wrong. And so I think that would be a sign that the economy is broken, which I just don't think that it is. We haven't gotten that sign, right? Everything we see says that we are in a downturn. We're in a period of slower growth. We're reacting to rates that are higher, all very normal things, and essentially what the Fed intended to do with higher rates. There's nothing that's saying that, okay, this is a disaster, we need to cut 50 basis points to get things moving. I think if we get a 25 basis point cut and the path is clear, I think it's the path that matters more than the magnitude.
All right, we appreciate the insight, Erica. I know it's been a very long week. Erica Meschmeyer, portfolio manager at Columbia Threadneedle Investments, giving us her outlook on this very confusing market. Jen, what is your team working on? What's the Eco team doing right now?
Well, we've got a lot of stories on the boil about relative valuation and what's the best way to think about the fallout from this very, very, very tricky market environment. And then, we're in the tail end of earnings season, and so we're sort of taking a step back and thinking, what's the big takeaway here? And what should we be thinking about heading into September and the next round of reports?
It's interesting because, as we were just talking about with SMIDs, it's like you might have the price valuation now, right? Like we've re-rated enough in certain areas, so the price is there, but other earnings there, so where the PE winds up coming down could be quite interesting.
Yeah, and then I am very interested in what the overall environment is, the enthusiasm for getting more involved or what the risk factor is.
Yeah, looking forward to all of that. Thank you very much. All right, coming up, we're not done yet. We're still here. You're still listening to Bloomberg Intelligence Radio on this Friday. We made it to the end of the week.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Stocks back in the green. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all higher. One notable exception on this Friday. Cisco Systems down now by 0.8%. Cisco planning to cut thousands more jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. This according to Reuters, as the networking equipment maker shifts its focus to faster growing businesses such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Cisco right now down 0.8%. Sweetgreen shares surging, ticker SG up now by 23% after the salad chain posted sales that outpaced market expectations and also raised its outlook for the full year. The stock already more than doubled in value this year through yesterday's close. Sweetgreen right now up by 23%. Paramount Global, the parent of Nickelodeon, MTV, and other channels, taking a second quarter impairment charge of $5.98 billion on its cable networks. Paramount Global up 0.2%. Day two on the job for Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg. Yesterday he walked the main factory floor near Seattle. So what should be at the top of his agenda? George Ferguson covers aerospace for Bloomberg Intelligence.
It's really about improving quality in their factories. I think that's number one, so that they can start to up throughput improve cash flow, improve their perception of quality with their customers. And I think it's getting back to a strong engineering culture.
George Ferguson of Bloomberg Intelligence. Boeing shares are right now down by 0.6%. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing's revenue rose 45% in July, accelerating its pace of growth from the June quarter. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Jen Ryan. Paul Sweeney is off today. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you live from our Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. I don't think it's raining right now, but we will see. It's also Friday, which is very exciting. We want to get you the world and national news right now. For that, we go to John Tucker.
All right, we'll start right there.
Yeah, let's do it.
So we do have the storm coming this way, probably for the metropolitan New York area. Not a lot of rain, but gusty winds. In fact, tornado watches have been posted as the remnants of Debbie move up the East Coast. And Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says rain is as much a concern as the winds in some area.
We're seeing numerous flash flood watches and even some flash flood warnings now stretching up the Shenandoah River Valley into Pennsylvania and central New York. A lot of the warnings that we've seen for flooding have been occurring around the Washington, D.C. area, northward of Washington, and then up towards the areas west of Philadelphia.
The forecaster also watching an area of thunderstorms and showers in the central Atlantic. This is between the Caribbean and Africa. And that, they say, has a 60% chance of becoming the season's next named storm. Kamala Harris has received some major support coming out of Silicon Valley. That story from Bloomberg's Ed Baxter.
A group of about 1,200 technology workers has pledged to back her ticket. Tech for Kamala, in a public letter calling Harris an archetypical innovator and champion of technology who worked to access STEM education, promote entrepreneurship, and close the digital equity gap. The people who signed the letter did so in personal capacities, not representing companies, but they come from companies including Apple, Meta, and Salesforce. It says it wants to mobilize the community of over 7 million workers. In San Francisco, Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
And a third teenager arrested in connection with that foiled attack on now canceled Taylor Swift concerts in Vienna. The 18-year-old taken into custody after allegedly being in contact with the main suspect in the case. Authorities say the plot appeared to be inspired by Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Investigators found bomb-making materials at one of the suspect's homes, they say. Officials say a suspect has confessed to planning to kill as many as possible outside the concert venue. And the UK government considering tightening online hate speech laws after provocations from figures including Elon Musk during 2 weeks of riots. Bloomberg has learned the government met social media executives earlier this week and is looking at introducing legal levers to force moderation of harmful content. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has repeatedly been criticized by ex-owner Elon Musk, who has also shared numerous right-wing conspiracy theories about the riots. Global news, 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Jen and Alex.
Thank you so much, John Tucker.
You made it to the weekend.
I haven't. I still got TV to do, but you know, you can go.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, you're not. And Jen's got to go unpack. Okay, here's an interesting article, and Jen sent it over here. It says that from New York to Denver, U.S. cities are seeking migrants for jobs, and in some ways this makes sense. These are those that have legal work permits, right? Federal work permits. If you can't find the staff, well, why not hire migrants?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. There's just such a great gap with business needs in some areas, like Denver, North Dakota, where the unemployment rate is really very, very low. And so the idea is let's put some programs together where we can match these workers. These are workers, you know, you've got a restaurant. These are your cooks and dishwashers, not eligible for the HB1 visas.
And how's it going?
Well, it seems to be going pretty well. I mean, certainly you're getting more workers in these jobs that have been really difficult to fill from the local population. But it's worth pointing out that some of the people that were interviewed for this story are very aware of concerns that you're going to get this wave of newcomer workers displacing these native-born workers, but they're just not getting the people to fill these jobs.
Yeah, really interesting. You should definitely check it out. It is by Ella Suran from New York to Denver. U.S. cities are seeking migrants for jobs. So programs letting businesses hire asylum seekers with work permits from the federal government to help bolster those local economies. Jen, thank you so much. I realize it was a big day for you with your move, but I appreciate you joining me on this Friday.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful weekend. Guys, have a wonderful weekend as well. You're looking at an equity market pretty much doing a whole lot of nothing right now, and volume is very light as well. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew up next.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The Swing State Show, it's still the economy, stupid. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as Bloomberg's Big Take finds cracks in swing state economies that could pose challenges to the Democratic ticket. We'll dig into the data coming up with Bloomberg's Sean Donan. Donald Trump leans into criticism of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. We'll talk about a stem winder of a news conference yesterday at Mar-a-Lago with Mark Caputo from the MAGAville newsletter at the Bulwark, with analysis from our political panel. Democratic strategist Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, alongside Maura Gillespie, Republican strategist at Blue Stack Strategies. This has been a week, certainly in politics and Wall Street, and that's where we start right now with Charlie Pellet in New York. Welcome to Friday, Charlie. How's it
Indeed,
look?
I thank you very much. Well, just as Joe Matthew goes on the air, stocks now negative across the board. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now. Little change, perhaps. That is the key takeaway on this Friday here. What a week, a wild week for markets, wrapping up subdued action in stocks. S&P right now, let's call that unchanged on the day. Traders do remain cautious after a historic surge in volatility. Right now, we've got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 53, a drop there of 0.1%. Again, after its biggest rally in almost 2 years, S&P 500 index up by just 1 point right now. NASDAQ down 18, a decline there of 0.1%. 10-year 3.93%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.02%. Spot gold up 0.2%, 24.32 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%, 76.72 for a barrel of WTI. As for the earnings outlook, Eric Friedman is Chief Investment Officer at U.S. Bank.
The key thing for us is that if you're in our chair, you start to look pretty quickly at 2025 earnings. And based on, the great work that Bloomberg does, there's a 14.5% earnings growth baked into the S&P for next year. After a year, we actually had earnings grow likely 10%. That's a pretty high growth rate when we have elections and we still have Fed funds at 5.3%.
Eric Friedman, the U.S. Bank Chief Investment Officer there. Cisco cutting thousands of jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Shares of Cisco down now by 1%. So again, recapping, equities lower across the board. Little change. The key takeaway at this hour. S&P down by 1 point. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Welcome to Friday. You made it to the threshold of the weekend in the Friday edition of Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, Blammo. You'll see our live stream coming from Washington and New York all day, every day here at Bloomberg. So it's the 9th of August, which not only means that it's Kaylee Lines and Rick Davis's birthday. Go Leos. But we're stepping into a new weekend here with the big road show through the swing states, at least for the Democrats. This is really interesting. The travel that we're following here. As the Harris-Walz ticket continues to pick through the swing states, they're doing 6 here now in total. Yesterday, they were in Phoenix. In fact, we'll be back in Arizona today, as well as Nevada. Interestingly, Donald Trump's going to be in Bozeman, Montana the swing state of Montana, for a rally at Montana State University. There are questions about the decisions that are being made here, and not only travel, but spending money and messaging as well. We're going to talk to Mark Caputo about this. Were you with us for the news conference yesterday on Bloomberg? Did you see this? Donald Trump holding forth at Mar-a-Lago. Let's give you a taste of what he said.
If you look at January 6th, which a lot of people aren't talking about very much, I think those people were treated very harshly. When you compare them to other things that took place in this country where a lot of people were killed, nobody was killed on January 6th. Of course there'll be a peaceful transfer, and there was last time, and there'll be a peaceful transfer. I just hope we're going to have honest elections. So I think the abortion issue has been very much tempered down. Nobody's spoken to crowds bigger than me. If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more.
That's just a taste. It went the better part of an hour. And I will say, to Donald Trump's credit, it was different than the last one, a news conference that was actually a speech. He did take reporters' questions and did some sparring with reporters. He didn't mic them, so a lot of people didn't hear the questions, referred to the fact that it was a tall ceiling, couldn't hear everything that was being said. He said it was an $18 million room that he was standing in. But we covered a lot of ground there, and it's something that, are we all right to go to Mark? Can we go to Mark Caputo? All right, author of the MAGAville newsletter and national political reporter at the Bulwark. Mark, it's great to have you back. We like talking to you because you're talking to folks inside the Trump campaign and inside the MAGA world, and I'm wondering your thoughts on this. If that was the campaign message that the Trump team has coalesced around that we saw and heard yesterday.
Well, there are a lot of messages there, but as Marshall McLuhan famously said, or to paraphrase what he said, the media is the message. Big part of that message is, I'm Donald Trump. I'm going to say what I think and what comes into my head, and I'm going to answer questions from the press, and you, the press, are derelict in not requiring the same of Kamala Harris. That was overall the point of the press conference. Now, as you had pointed out, there was a farrago of falsehoods, to put it mildly. There were a disparate and desultory collection of statements and policy there, and there wasn't really a very coherent message. But the overarching reason for having this was Donald Trump wanted to get in the spotlight again. He did that, and he wanted to drive the message that the media wasn't holding Kamala Harris accountable just to merely answer questions from them. And to a degree, it appeared to have worked because she stopped to answer a handful of questions from the press after his press conference.
Sure, and we've got some news on debates. I don't know if all three are going to happen, but this is good. Like the back and forth. But the idea of discipline when it comes to messaging is something that a lot of people were talking about again, Mark, following this romp with the press. To think that we're talking about comparing crowd sizes to the I Have a Dream speech. I mean, when you get to that point, what are the campaign advisors thinking who are standing in the back of the room?
Well, I can tell you what I think they're thinking and what they're saying. What they're saying is it's the president's campaign. That's what they call former President Trump. He dictates the policy and direction. We follow orders and we try to help him win. I believe what they're privately saying is, or thinking is, palm to forehead. My God, why does he keep doing this? The difference between this campaign and prior ones is this has been built with the idea that Donald Trump is going to have lots of Donald Trump moments. And yesterday you saw a Donald Trump moment or a series of Donald Trump moments in one big moment.
This was, by the way, he was comparing his speech on January 6th, not the inauguration. This is a January 6th speech. He says, had a bigger crowd than Martin Luther King. He said, we actually had more people. The Associated Press had to run some numbers on this. For the record, Martin Luther King's crowd was 25 times larger. He got into Kamala Harris's crowds as well, Mark, saying that his were 20 to 50 times larger. That also was not true. Her crowds have been beating his. Are we going to do the crowd size thing for the rest of the campaign?
Well, if the media asks him crowd-sized questions, I think then, yeah, he's going to answer them, and he's going to answer them the same way, which is not honestly or not realistically. This is what you get.
That's what you get. Talk to us about his take on Tim Walz. It was interesting to hear he's going for things he said that nobody's ever heard of, heavy into transgender and all these different worlds, he said, having to do with safety. The idea being that we haven't quite crafted the message yet, or was he simply not using it? What does the campaign think about, other than dangerously liberal? What will we hear or learn about Tim Walz?
Well, the main message that the campaign and the vice presidential candidate for Trump was driving concerning Tim Walz was his statements and his record about his military service. There appears to have been some embellishments. They did wind up correcting. I think Politico used the word tweak, fixing an online description of Walz's rank. He served for 24 years in the military. So that's probably the biggest sort of frontal assault or flanking assault, it depends on how you want to look at it, against Walz that the Trump campaign has launched. Trump is much more attuned to culture war issues, and therefore, regarding transgender policy, Walz has signed legislation supporting transgender therapies for minors and allowing for the dispensal of free feminine products in restrooms in schools, which conservatives have said, that's tampons in boys' bathrooms, and they've called him Tampon Tim. Now, Trump didn't say that yesterday. I guess I'm almost a little surprised he didn't say that yesterday, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does wind up ultimately saying something like that. But you never know.
Things we learn.
Donald Trump is sort of the box of chocolates that you open in Forrest Gump.
Fair enough. I should like to be running that campaign. Is there a spokesman or a campaign advisor he trusts, Mark? Because the reporting is he's been doing a lot of complaining lately about what's happening inside the House.
I don't think that reporting's that true. So I think the people who are saying that he's doing a lot of the complaining about the campaign are people who are complaining about the campaign and saying that Trump is doing it. That having been said, it's not ultimately going to surprise me if Trump complains about the campaign and blames other people if he loses. But as the first part of our conversation here has shown, and as the objective coverage of his speech has shown, and as prior coverage of his other speeches have shown, the biggest problem Donald Trump faces in the Donald Trump campaign is Donald Trump. It's not the campaign.
We heard about Willie Brown yesterday. This is another strange moment. He talked about having a near-death experience with Willie Brown in a helicopter. Turns out he meant Jerry Brown.
Yeah, one Brown, two
the governor.
Brown. What can Brown do for you, right? You know?
Well, nothing good now, apparently, because Willie Brown weighed in. He actually talked to a local station. Of course, he had a long relationship, as we know, with Kamala Harris. Are we going to hear about that from Donald Trump? Was that where he thought he was going with this story?
Well, remember, this was a press conference, and the press conference that Trump had yesterday had two different types of press there. It was elite mainstream media, and it was conservative media. So some of the questions you heard were from conservative media, and if I'm not mistaken, this question there was asked by conservative media to tee him up on talking about Willie Brown, and then he promptly whipped it.
That is fascinating. So we are going to hear about it. I mean, you keep bumping into it on social media.
Trump has already brought it up.
You know, this idea that.
Trump is the first one who brought it up. I think I can remember almost remember the exact date. I believe it's July 5th, but I could be wrong about that. Where Harris, he was discussing Harris on his Truth social media platform, and he specifically singled out Willie Brown. So Trump has brought it up. He's probably not going to shy away from that. The problem that Trump has is he also doesn't shy away from, fantasy. He's on this plane with Willie Brown. It was Jerry Brown. It almost crashed. Apparently it didn't almost crash. And on and on and on.
Jeez. Just lastly, Mark, if Joe Biden had messed up Willie Brown for Jerry Brown, people would be calling him to drop out of the race, right?
I don't know about that. I do know the media's covered this quite a bit. So I've seen some social media traffic on there like, oh, if this happened to Biden, the press would be talking about it. Well, the press is talking about it. I mean, that's what you and I are talking about right now. So I don't.
You're here.
I don't buy the equivalency of that. The idea that Trump has gotten some sort of free ride, I think, is pretty absurd. You just look at the coverage. In fact, the New Yorker today, interestingly enough, or maybe it moved last night, they wrote a piece about how come the media is not asking Kamala Harris to explain anything about all of her policy reversals. She was for fracking, now she's against it, and on and on and on. But that's not covered either.
That's going to be a very real question. It's going to get a lot louder as we get into and out of Chicago.
Well, I mean, the press had an opportunity to ask her that yesterday, and just speaking of whiffing, just whiffed
on the tarmac. Yeah. Well, when she decides to answer some questions, we'll be talking about it here as well.
Yeah, I guess she had about
great
like
to
6
see
questions,
again.
right? So,
something like that, yeah. Didn't even learn necessarily about the debates, but we'll keep following this. Mark, it's good to see you. Thank you. Find the Magaville newsletter and his work at the Bulwark. A great conversation always with Mark Caputo here on Balance of Power. I want to turn to the stock market here. Just think about where we were on Monday. This was our lead story. Remember the end of the world market, the carried trade, the recession that came out of nowhere, the Fed that missed the opportunity. Well, we're not doing great today, but things have stabilized a lot since Monday, and we wanted to talk about it with Jess Menton, Bloomberg's senior equities reporter, deputy team leader, has had a heck of a week. And Jess, it's great for you to bookend the week with us here, because you and I were talking on Monday, and there was a lot of fear in this market. How much of this, now that we've had some time to breathe, was just the carried trade versus fears of a slowdown?
It was a roller coaster week indeed. And to your point, it was much more complicated than people just pointing at some of the data points. Obviously, like last Friday when we had that latest employment report where we saw a fourth consecutive rise in the unemployment rate. But we already had stocks actually selling off the day before that on the back on the heels of obviously the Federal Reserve decision when we had that huge rally on the 31st of July there. But ever since then, we've seen that unwind. So some of it was kind of a sell the news moment. You also had the yen carry trade because also the Bank of Japan had a rate decision that week. And now when you're looking at this, a lot of the economic concerns have subsided. We had the jobless claims data yesterday that came in lower than expected. But of course, all eyes are on next week's CPI data because the option market is pricing in a 1.2% swing in either direction for the S&P 500. That's much more elevated than it normally has been over the average over the last 12 months.
And this seems like a market that needs some information right now, Jess, right? I suspect maybe we don't do a lot until then. Nobody knows what to do now.
Well, if you look at what the flows are telling us, actually EPFR, and this data goes through the latest week through Wednesday, but actually you are still seeing money going into U.S. large cap stocks, coming out of small cap stocks, and also surprisingly, maybe to some people, but you are seeing technology getting a bid there too, had the most inflows in the last week when you're looking at that. But then you're also seeing those income corners of the market like real estate and utilities still taking in money on that anticipation, obviously, of rate cuts coming soon.
Jess, it's great to have you back. Thank you for your time this week. I know you're not quite there yet, but it's been a big one for Jess Menton's team, Bloomberg senior equities reporter with our eyes on the markets here. As I mentioned, we're lower, but not by a lot. The S&P 500 down just 4 points right now, fraction of a percent. The NASDAQ's down 46 as we slide into the weekend, kind of put a bow on earnings season, although we have a couple of good ones left. Crude oil's holding positive, approaching $77 a barrel right now. Much more to follow. Mike Shepard from our Washington Bureau with news on another clampdown on EVs in China. The story's next, only on Bloomberg.
12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and the NASDAQ 100 index all in the red right now. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares also trading lower. That index now down by 0.7%. The S&P lower, little change, down 2 points, down just under 0.1%. And we have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 58, down 0.1%, while NASDAQ is lower by 0.2%. Bottom line here, stocks ending the week with a whimper after days of drama. What a week it has been. The 10-year at 3.93%, the 2-year 4.03%. Spot gold is trading higher, up just about 0.1%, 24.29 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.9%, 76.87 for barrel of WTI. Cisco said to be cutting thousands of jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. That according to Reuters. Cisco shares now lower by 1%. After earnings, Sweetgreen, the salad chain, that stock soaring by 24% after it posted sales that outpaced market expectations and raised its outlook for the full year. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 4 right now. That is a drop of just under 0.1%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here's Joe Matthew.
Charlie, thank you so much. Happy Friday. Thanks for being with us here on Balance of Power. The Friday edition, indeed. We'll keep tabs on this market for you, as we always do. Charlie will be back a little bit later on this hour as we cover, of course, what's happening on the campaign trail. Harris Walz back in the swing states today. It's Arizona and Nevada. Donald Trump in the swing state of Montana. Not so swingy, but Montana it is, where he'll be holding a rally later on today. Interesting choices on the travel schedule, but we have to remember that there's still an incumbent president who has this job for a couple of more months. And we are expecting some important news to come from the White House when it comes to EVs and the crackdown on Chinese technology. Now, as we've established, and if you have ever tried to buy a Chinese EV, you already know you can't get them around here. There's a 27% tariff that goes back to the Trump administration, which is why BYDs are not driving around the streets in your neighborhood. Remember, Joe Biden says he's going to increase those tariffs to 100%. So the cars aren't coming. But there's a question about the software. These cars can't run without it. And that's where Michael Shepard comes in with a really important story here at Bloomberg. And I've been looking forward to this. Bloomberg senior editor for technology and strategic industries. Suddenly one of the most important jobs in the room. And it's great to see you, Mike. Welcome back.
It's great to see you, Joe.
Talk to me about what we're about to learn here. How do you keep the software out of the cars? And are we preventing a problem, or is this something already happening?
Well, what they're trying to do is stave off the widespread proliferation of this technology in cars that are coming. Yep. This is the next generation of vehicles. Okay. We're talking about EVs. We're also talking about autonomously driven cars. Mm-hmm. We're even talking about the gas electric cars that have some sort of connection now to the internet. We see cars with the navigation software, with some sort of internet connection. Mm-hmm. They're not the vehicles that you and I learned to drive on.
How true.
These are computers with 4 wheels. Right. And they are connected to the internet, and that is creating what the administration sees as a cybersecurity risk. The president, back in March, decided to launch an investigation into this to find out what the vulnerabilities, in particular to state actors, would be. And China, of course, is one of the biggest concerns.
That's fascinating. So it's kind of a Huawei story in the auto sector.
In a way, that's a good analogy to make because, you know, one of the concerns for many years was that Huawei's phones and switches and routers created an opportunity for Chinese intelligence or military agencies to be able to tap into data here and then ship that data back to China and use it to whatever intelligence or their own national security means or needs are. And think about it this way. It also is a little bit reminiscent of what we're seeing on TikTok, where they are trying to restrict the ownership of this company from not being Chinese. They want the Chinese owner, ByteDance, to sell it out of a concern that China's government could somehow gain access to information on and data about all the users here.
So it's a digital Trojan horse, essentially. Who would China be working with? Who would be the buyers of this software? Are they U.S. automakers, or are we talking about foreign automakers? Could be any of them.
Any of them looking for the lowest cost, highest quality version of the kind of software that they would need to provide this functionality to drivers. Because, you know, just like with TikTok users, they like the app. And as drivers, we want the car to work the way we want it to, which is you want the navigation to function. If you want to be able to find that song using Spotify or some other app, you want that to work too. But it does require this connectivity. And that is the vulnerability that the administration is preparing to address.
It's really interesting that we're having this conversation, and I'd love to know more about how the White House is going to accomplish this and through what process. But Elon Musk is testing software in China right now as he tries to develop an autonomous fleet. That's not by accident.
Well, it's the other side of the coin, because China is also such a huge market, and U.S. companies, including Tesla, cannot ignore that. But interestingly, you brought up BYD earlier. BYD sold in the fourth quarter of last year more fully electric vehicles than Tesla. And Tesla is the household name when it comes to electric cars. And now that he is preparing to branch into this new area of autonomous, fully autonomous vehicles in certain places and really trying to make some gains there, China is pushing. And we have seen China make advances in other technologies that Americans and American companies have pioneered and developed. And solar panels is a great example where the U.S. industry was so strong, and it very quickly lost ground to Chinese rivals who took the technology, were able to advance it and produce it far more cheaply, and now dominate worldwide.
You know, it's really interesting. You talk about BYD. They've accomplished something that Tesla has not in creating a consumer-priced electric vehicle. Is that partly because of the software? If they started selling Chinese software that lowers the cost for EVs, so it would be attractive for an automaker to have this.
BYD, Joe, and other Chinese makers and companies have had a lot of state support and subsidies to help them get off the ground, to help with their growth and their advancement and their research. So you do see them making inroads. On a recent visit to South America for family purposes with a little bit of business mixed in.
Yes, sir.
One of the striking things was the growing number of Chinese branded vehicles,
So
not only BYD, but Geely and others on the streets. Dealerships everywhere. At a mall in my wife's hometown in central Brazil, we saw a big display for BYD. In years past, it might have been Toyota, it might have been Ford, but now China is taking that place.
And in the United States, most people don't even know what BYD is. This is the one, I guess, dark zone for that company.
Right, very much so. And the administration with this tariffs increase is really trying to erect a very strong barrier against the entry, because it would be devastating for the U.S. auto industry. But, you know, it is a twofold argument for the Biden administration. It's the national security one, but as I just mentioned, it is also the economic security argument as well. The administration is concerned about trying to maintain, and you know, both campaigns really in the presidential race right now are really making the argument for preserving the domestic manufacturing base, and that extends to the auto industry as well.
This is a fascinating conversation. Does the president do this through Treasury? Is it an EO? How does it work?
This will work by a Commerce Department finding. They have been leading the investigation here, and they will be the ones who impose these controls, because they are the agency that is in charge of, you know, imports and exports, and they will be the ones to, you know, set the regulations about what comes in and what doesn't, and what vehicle software would actually fall under this category, and also how fast it will have to be put into place. The industry and other governments are actually balking a little bit at this. They want to make sure the scope isn't too wide, and they also want to make sure they have enough time to arrange for a domestic supply chain here in the U.S.
Should we assume, and maybe we shouldn't, that Kamala Harris backs all of this, that if there were a Harris administration, this would be in place?
That's a great question, Joe, because the continuity of this kind of policy is very important for manufacturers and for technology companies and for foreign counterparts, including governments. And they will want to know, okay, where does the U.S. stand? So far, we haven't seen any daylight between Kamala Harris as vice president and the rest of the administration when it comes to China. She's talked tough there. And we don't think that there will be much change, even if Gina Raimondo were to step down or step aside in a new administration as Commerce Secretary, that there would be that much of a sea change in this policy approach. It is also part of the, talk here in Washington and part of the mantra here in a way that China has been an economic challenge for the U.S., and it's time to keep doing something about it.
This is really fascinating stuff. You can find the story on the terminal and online. The headline, U.S. poised to confront China over EV technology with new limits. If you watch the program, you know Michael Shepard's been doing this for a minute. Of course, you've got a fascinating new charge, and I hope that we can tap into your reporting more often here when it comes to these types of stories. But you've been knocking around Washington for a minute covering politics. And, a lot of people hit up Shep in the hallways here and ask him what's really going on in the world. I just wonder in our remaining moment, how you view this particular moment in time. We're talking about how little we know, for instance, about Kamala Harris on certain issues. What are we going to find out about this ticket in the next couple of weeks, and what has your attention?
Well, the time question is really of the essence, Joe, because we're getting a crash course in who Kamala Harris is. And because she has been part of this administration for 4 years now, almost 4 years, it is really hard to see, okay, where does she distinguish herself from President Joe Biden? And are there certain areas where we'll see her be much more of herself? And the one thing that we are noting, though, that is such a difference, a visible difference since her entry into the race as Joe Biden stepped out, is this vibe shift, this energy that has all of a sudden infused the Democratic Party and has really left her opponent, Donald Trump, reeling and, as you discussed at the top of the show, trying to grasp for answers and how to cope with a new candidate that even he doesn't know that much about.
Isn't that something? The ground is again shifting under our feet, and we're glad to have Michael Shepard with us to help figure it out. Great to see you. Have a great weekend, Michael. As we continue here on the fastest show in politics, we'll assemble our panel next. First, world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Weather's the big story today. Flood warnings and watches stretching from Georgia to New Hampshire. Heavy rain warnings are up in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick as post-tropical cyclone Debbie tracks across the eastern U.S. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says the rain is just as much of a concern as the winds.
We're seeing numerous flash flood watches and even some flash flood warnings now stretching up the Shenandoah River Valley into Pennsylvania and central New York. A lot of the warnings that we've seen for flooding have been occurring around the Washington, D.C. area, northward of Washington, and then up towards the areas west of Philadelphia.
Debbie first came ashore in Florida on Monday as a hurricane and has killed at least 7 people and pushed more than 100 rivers into flood stage. The Summer Games in Paris wrapping up this weekend. The U.S. leads with the number of medals at 104. China has 77. France has 55. And China has the most gold medals with 32. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are wrapping up a wild week with a whimper little change for the U.S. equity market, hanging on to yesterday's gains with the S&P up another 4 points right now. 53.23 is where that index stands, up by about 0.1%. The Dow down 3 points, flat on the day. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index down 13. A little change there, just under 0.1%. The 10-year 3.93%, the 2-year 4.03%. Spot gold higher by $4 the ounce now to $24.31, up 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, $76.94 a barrel. After yesterday's surge in Bitcoin, up again today, now higher by 1%. Bitcoin above 60,000, back above 60,000, 60,211 right now on Bitcoin. Some of the other stories that we're following for you: Cisco Systems planning to eliminate thousands more jobs in another round of layoffs this year. This according to Reuters, as the networking equipment maker shifts its focus to faster growing businesses such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Right now we have got Cisco Systems trading lower by 1%. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing's revenue rose 45% in July, accelerating its pace of growth from the June quarter. Taiwan Semiconductor up by 0.6%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed, little change. The key takeaway with the S&P 500 index holding on to a gain of just under 0.1%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We'll be back with Charlie a little later this hour as we keep tabs on the markets here, feeling a lot more stable, even though we're not in rally mode today, than certainly things felt on Monday. Thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and you'll find our smiling faces here in the studio. If you learn anything today listening to Bloomberg Radio, and we're going to give you a couple of chances to do this, learn this: the economy that matters most is not national. This is the most important story you're going to read on the terminal or online if you care about this race and the 7 swing states we have been talking about for months that are going to decide this election. The economy is not a monolith. Sean Donnan and his colleagues are out with an incredible piece of journalism today in The Big Take. This is world-class stuff. This is journalism you don't do overnight here. It's a remarkable piece that combines anecdotal evidence in the swing states with hard data that you would expect from Bloomberg. These 7 states, home to 61 million people, a combined gross domestic product in 2023 of $4.4 trillion, showing economic cracks that could prove a political obstacle for Vice President Kamala Harris, as I read in the story. Sean's with us at the table right now. It's great to see you. Congrats on a great story here.
Thanks so much.
In fact, it's
Wonderful
about
to be
100
here.
stories in one, well, at least 7. If you want to see a real great marriage, as I said, of data and anecdotal journalism, this is it. Let's start in the blue wall states. What do our listeners need to know about the difference in these economies, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, than where some of us may live?
Yeah, look, there's a fundamental thing that we found here, and that is that those blue wall states, which are the kind of the core of the campaign right now, that's where the Democrats are focused. And where the Republicans are hoping to exploit some weaknesses. And the reality is they've grown since 2019 at a third of the rate of the rest of the United States when you adjust for inflation and population changes and so on. And that means that, you know, when Joe Biden was the candidate and when he was out there talking about the great and this remarkable national recovery that we've seen in the economy from the pandemic recession, he was talking about a national recovery, but in the blue wall, that story looks very different. And in particular, we went to a place called Erie County. That place has been one of the slowest places to recover from the pandemic recession. By the end of 2022, which is the last data we have available, it was actually 3.2% smaller, that economy, once you adjust for inflation, than it was before the pandemic.
Well, you guys spent time, and you mentioned Erie County. You went there and talked to real people, which is why partly this story is wonderful. One of them was Curtis Jones Jr., former Erie Democratic City Councilman. Here's what he had to say.
We see projects, we see economic development happening, but don't always say, oh, that's because of the Biden administration or it's because of the governor. Like, most people aren't thinking that way. The average person is struggling. It's an interesting dichotomy, almost like the tale of two cities, right? So you've got funding for business development, economic development projects in our downtown, but we're also seeing, regrettably, an increased number of unhoused and underhoused in our community. Individual households are struggling significantly because of the cost increases.
Really interesting take here, and there are two numbers that are awfully important about Erie that you point out. One, GDP per capita, 3.2% smaller by the end of 22 than it was in 2019. The other one is Joe Biden won the county by only 1,400 votes in 2020.
Yeah.
You put those together, you've got a challenge.
You've got a challenge. You've also got a continuing challenge in that the manufacturing sector there hasn't seen the recovery that you've seen, or the increase in jobs that you've seen in some of the Sun Belt states like Georgia and Arizona and so on. It's a place that's continuing to lose population as well. So, the unemployment rate looks at a historic low, but there's 10% fewer people working in factories than there were just 10 years ago.
That's incredible. So talk to us more about the Sun Belt states, because we've been hearing that there could be a new path here for this Harris ticket. It's different than Biden. And yes, it's Georgia. It's also Arizona, where you find that the housing squeeze is still severe.
Yeah, no, look, if you look at Arizona, which has been the real outperformer in terms of the swing states in terms of growth, right? So in terms of real GDP per capita growth, they grew about 12% between 2019 and the end of 23. That's good, right? And a lot of that is a result of investment in new chips plants there, a big increase in the population there. But again, when you start looking on the ground, you start finding housing costs have gone up remarkably. They've doubled since 2019. For a median household in a place like Arizona or Nevada, they were paying 18 to 20% of their income on their mortgage on a median house in 2019. That's now up around 36, 37% in those states. That's a meaningful difference for most families in terms of just getting some shelter over them.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to say on Bloomberg that context matters, and this is a pretty great example of it. Congrats on a great piece, John, and thanks for talking with us here on Balance of Power.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can find it, of course, on the podcast as well, on the terminal and online. A great story here on the Big Take that I encourage you to check out, to have a better, not just to sound smart at the cocktail party, that'll be the case too, but to have a better understanding of these debates that we have every day on this program. Each of these states brings a different component and a different challenge to both campaigns, as it's borne out in the data, as well as the real human beings we talk to. Speaking of real human beings, we have two of them on our great panel today. It's time to assemble. Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and political science professor at Iona University. Maura Gillespie is here too, Republican strategist and founder of Blue Stack Strategies. Wonderful panel, and great to see you both. Welcome today. Jeannie, I'd like to ask you about some of what we just learned. This is fascinating to me as you make your way through the blue wall, through the Sun Belt. Each state has a different economic story to tell, and Kamala Harris is going to find out firsthand as she travels to these states this week that their economies are not, in many cases, keeping up with the rest of the country. If the swing states are going to decide this election, Jeannie, how does Kamala Harris win with that in mind?
Well, can I first say I need to have Sean come talk to my students about great data-driven journalism, because this, to your point, is a great piece. I think what Kamala Harris does have this challenge on the economy, regardless about how well received she has been. People still give the Republicans and Donald Trump much higher numbers on the economy. This has been the story of this election pre-Kamala Harris's ascension and post. And I think the irony of this race is that regardless of how sour people are on the economy, Donald Trump hasn't yet been able to use that, and it's only been a few weeks, against Kamala Harris. And we saw this on display yesterday. Right when he starts to talk about economic issues, he seems to get distracted by things like crowd sizes and his hate for Brian Kemp. And, part of the irony is that you can think of almost any traditional Republican candidate being able to make this case on the economy against Kamala Harris. But because Donald Trump is so distracted by the things he really cares about, like crowd size, the fact that, he can't figure out, things about like the election being stolen and comparisons between Alabama and Mississippi in 2020, that he doesn't talk about the economy in the way he should. And so that's where Kamala Harris gets this advantage.
Maura, does Jeannie have a point there? Staying on the economy is productive when you look at the map here for Donald Trump, because otherwise we're talking about advantage Trump in all of these states, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I think Jeannie makes a good point that he does get so distracted. So sometimes especially watching yesterday, I thought, does he actually want to win? Because if he talked about the economy, talked about safety and security, those are two policy issues that are going to be very important come November. And yet he gets himself all spun up about the media not reporting his accurate crowd sizes, comparing himself to having the same crowd size as Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech. I mean, these are things that, and I believe in about 5-10 years, we're going to look back and cannot believe that this is what was said by the not only former president, but somebody who is leading the pack here to become the next president. So if Republicans watching this who are running down ballot could just focus on the economy, their policy issues that would be strong for re-election or for election, then they will do well come November. I don't know that I can say the same about Donald Trump, but I do think that Republicans should be really focused on those two main issues and campaigning on those to make a dent come November.
You know, Jeannie, I'm struck by the presence of COVID in the data here. The 7 swing states have a disproportionate share of their population living in counties that had not yet recovered to their pre-pandemic levels. We're talking GDP here, by the end of 2022. And when you isolate those counties that did not recover to their pre-pandemic level, a vast majority of them were carried by Donald Trump in the 2020 election. That could happen again here, correct?
It absolutely could. I mean, the numbers are on his side when you look at the public opinion poll numbers. I mean, people really do think that if they are asked who they trust more with their economy, it is going to be Donald Trump and the GOP. And I think what Kamala Harris needs to try to do is to talk specifically about what Donald Trump has said his plans are. Most economists say his plans, as he has laid them out, are inflationary. So if we do get a Fed cut in interest rates come September, that'll be a point for Harris and Biden to celebrate that. Many Americans will likely see that as a sign that inflation is going down and in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction. And so, you know, this would be something that they could use and juxtapose what his plans are versus her plans. But again, it's not something she's going to have to address until and unless he starts to talk about the economy specifically. And I would just add, his job has become harder since she has ascended because, of course, now, even though she's from the incumbent administration, she can talk about what she plans to do as president. She doesn't have as much defending to do as a Joe Biden would have.
Is it just about talking about the economy, Maura? Donald Trump can criticize Joe Biden clearly when it comes to these data all day long. Or does he need a plan on how to lower prices? What's his inflation plan? So far, all we've heard is drill, baby, drill.
For the MAGA supporters, he can just continue to hit on the Biden-Harris administration and the ways that he believes they destroyed our economy. He can hit on that all day long, and MAGA will come out for him and will rally behind that messaging. But I think for those voters who are not so keen on Donald Trump, but really don't see any path that they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, he needs to try and reach them and convince them to vote for him, as opposed to a third party or a write-in opportunity there. So he needs to talk about what it is that he plans on actually doing. Again, I watching some of these rallies in Georgia, watching yesterday's speech or press conference, it makes me feel as though he doesn't actually want to be president. He just wants this fanfare around him having the attention and having people, fairly or kindly talk about him in the media. And unfortunately for the American people, that's going to be a problem if we, again, see an administration which is not reflective of what he had in 2016. Most of those people he had with him are gone. So what is it that he plans to do should he become president? And who is he bringing in with him? I mean, I think these are questions that voters really need to get a handle on before they get to the polls in November.
Well, I find it really interesting to put a cap on this conversation about the swing states and their economies. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz today are in Arizona and Nevada. Donald Trump is in Bozeman, Montana. And I'll just leave that there for right now. Much more with our panel coming up. Maura Gillespie and Jeannie Shanzano, from whom we always learn something. We'll be back in our second hour. Also, a special conversation ahead with Congressman Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland, at the table next on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Kamala Harris continues the swing state roadshow as the Trump campaign tries to seize on a message. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with the latest on the campaign. We'll sit down with Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy and a special conversation ahead with Congressman Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland, with us on the campaign rhetoric, the Senate race in his state, and how to rebuild the collapsed Key Bridge in Baltimore. Our panel is in place, and so is Charlie Pellet to help us start with Wall Street. As always, a look at the markets this Friday. Charlie, how are we doing?
Well, I tell you, Joe, it's been a wild week on the political front, and certainly that describes what is happening in U.S. markets. What a week this has been, but at Bloomberg, we're going for the gold with the S&P right now up 9, gain right now of 0.2%. We got the Dow up 25, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ back in the green right now, a turnaround from our last update, up 9 now. That is a gain of just under 0.1%. Your 10-year, 3.93%. The 2-year, 4.03%. Spot gold at $24.34 the ounce, up $7, up 0.3%. Bitcoin building on yesterday's surge. Bitcoin up another 1.5%, 60,424 on Bitcoin. And crude, West Texas Intermediate crude, ending the week with a 76 handle, 76.91 right now, up by about 1%. Cisco said to be cutting thousands of jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. That according to Reuters. Cisco shares, they're down now by 0.7%. Sweet Green shares, the salad chain, that stock ripping higher right now, up by 27.8% after last night's earnings report. So lots going on in U.S. markets. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P right now higher by 9, up by about 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, the Friday edition of Balance of Power live from Washington. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. As the campaigns continue travel, we've got a couple of big ones today. Importantly, the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz campaign sticking to the swing states we've been talking about so much, Arizona and Nevada today, where Donald Trump, interestingly, is in Bozeman, Montana for his one rally of the week here, raising questions about the travel schedule, not to mention the deployment of resources in other areas. That's where we start with Gregory Cordy, Bloomberg Politics reporter. It's great to see you, Gregory. These are obviously valuable days for both campaigns. And as we watch the Democratic ticket do 6 swing states this week, how is the Trump campaign managing itself in Montana?
Yeah, it seems almost like an October fever that we have, and it's only August. This was a question that former President Trump was asked at his news conference yesterday in Mar-a-Lago. He got testy at the question. The question was, why aren't you in the swing states? He says, look, I'm here. I'm talking to you. I'm campaigning from Mar-a-Lago. I'm on the phone all of the time. But, the two most valuable things that any campaign has is one is the hard money, the dollars, the campaign contributions to put up TV ads. And the other is the candidate's time. And where the candidate spends his or her time says a lot about how they see the map, which voters they're trying to motivate. And at this point, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are working the swing states, and Donald Trump is working Mar-a-Lago and, as you point out, Montana, which is very important in the Senate context.
Right.
But I think both parties would agree they'd much rather have the White House.
So let's talk about this news conference. By the way, it was a news conference. There were actual reporters' questions, which is not always
including one from our own Nancy Cook, who was there.
That's right, yeah. The couple of planted questions, too, I understand, from some of the folks who were there asking about various things. But we played the greatest hits here. I don't think Hannibal Lecter made an appearance, but all the other stuff did here, including crowd sizes. We're doing crowds. So he's talking about MLK's crowd size for the I Had a Dream speech. Isn't that the definition of a distraction?
Yeah, you remember a couple weeks ago we were in Milwaukee at the Republican convention. We were talking about how after the assassination attempt, the attempt on Trump's life, he was going to be a sort of a new candidate. He was going to have a new sort of rhetoric. He was going to downplay all of those sort of greatest hits that you're talking about. And of course, we're right back to the same Trump. He can't help himself. And it doesn't matter whether it's a rally or a convention nomination acceptance speech or a press conference. He's going to go back to some of those same themes as he always does. And his divergences. We didn't get, as you said, Hannibal Lecter. We did get a little bit of an aside on the acoustics of Mar-a-Lago, how much it was worth. $18
million.
$18 million is according
to
the...
that room, I think.
Yeah. So it's this is the Trump we have come to know as Americans over the past 8 years.
That's the Trump you're going to get, apparently, attempted assassination or not. But we're playing with some pretty hot stuff here. It's not just crowd sizes. It's racial tropes. It's stolen valor. Is this the campaign?
Again, this goes back to, I think, the comment I made earlier. Like, this feels like October.
Yeah.
These are October-level attacks.
October's in 5 minutes, by the way. We are in the sprint now. This is the fast-forward time.
Absolutely. Although, there used to be a day, I'm old enough to remember, when before Labor Day, both parties kind of thought, well, people aren't really paying attention yet.
Yeah, right.
We'll do some organizational work.
I keep hearing that, actually.
But no, it's a dog days. We haven't even had the Democratic convention yet. And these kind of fever pitch attacks, which have become more common in American politics over the past decade or so, certainly Trump has contributed to it. But, to be fair, Democrats also have engaged in some somewhat crude insinuations about J.D. Vance, which I'm not going to repeat here, but I think people can probably use their imagination. It's a furniture-related
something
line of attack.
Heard that.
So, this is the state of our politics now.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the Democrats more for a minute, because Kamala Harris getting a lot of criticism, and you could even argue the main reason why Donald Trump did that yesterday is because people want her to have a news conference, stand there for 45 minutes or an hour, take questions, sit down, have a hard-hitting interview with a journalist. I don't know if they're at the point yet where they have to do this. As you said, we're going into the convention. There are a lot of things happening. They're introducing a running mate. But there is something real to that.
Well, yes, and as you know, because you've been in this business a long time too, the longer she goes without doing it, the more the bubble inflates.
The harder that interview will be too.
Expectations fall on that interview or that press conference or whatever venue it takes. She did take some questions, a few of them on the tarmac yesterday, I think it was. But yeah, look, she has won the Democratic nomination for president without a single delegate voting, or a single primary or caucus voter voting for one of her delegates. Those delegates have now switched over to her, but she has not had to make the case in the same grueling primary process that we usually put our presidential candidates through of why she's the best candidate for president of the United States. Yeah. She is not on the record on a number of different questions of how her views of the world may differ from the person who she has served under as president, Joe Biden. And so, yeah, those questions are going to mount until she starts to go out and answer some of them.
I still say they take the edge off by doing a sit down with the two of them, right? Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, sit down with friendly, whatever, do entertainment, whatever you got to do, and then follow it up with the hard-hitting interview.
You start with the
Here I am
shows,
giving campaign advice on the air.
Do a little bit of lifestyle-like things.
Dare I say couch? You said do the couch interview on the morning show, right?
Absolutely.
That's what's coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Campaign advice from Gregory Cordy, not me. It's great to see you. Bloomberg politics reporter, not your job indeed, but he covers politics the best of them, and it's great to have you at the table always, Gregory. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. As we recall the news conference at Mar-a-Lago, you saw and heard it live in its entirety. Well, we were just talking about this a short time ago. Here's a taste of Donald Trump holding forth with reporters at Mar-a-Lago.
If you look at January 6th, which a lot of people aren't talking about very much, I think those people were treated very harshly. When you compare them to other things that took place in this country where a lot of people were killed, nobody was killed on January 6th. Of course there'll be a peaceful transfer, and there was last time, and there'll be a peaceful transfer. I just hope we're going to have honest elections. So I think the abortion issue has been very much tempered down. Nobody's spoken to crowds bigger than me. If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more.
To think that was out of an hour. We could keep playing things for quite a while. The Associated Press, by the way, did a little bit of homework on that. For the record, Martin Luther King Jr.'s crowd that day was 25 times larger than Donald Trump's was on the 6th of January, not to mention some of the other things that happened that day as he refers to a peaceful transition of power. This is where we start our conversation with the gentleman from Maryland. Congressman Glenn Ivey is with us, Democrat representing Maryland's 4th District, which I drive through every day on my way to work. Congressman, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you in person here. I'm not going to drag you through this campaign stuff for our entire conversation because there are a couple of issues I'd really like to hit with you. But let's start there. The rhetoric that we're hearing in this campaign is one that's concerning a lot of folks, as we're now regressing into racial tropes, stolen valor, the rest that you're hearing along with us. How does the Harris-Walz campaign respond to that?
Well, so far, I think they've been able to almost ignore it because many of those comments contain critiques within themselves.
Is that the best defense?
Yeah, I think it depends. I'll have to see how things play out. And if he keeps doing press conferences like the one yesterday, where it's just one bizarre statement after another. The January 6th comments, for example, where you've had, I think, over 1,000 people have been convicted of criminal offenses, some for sedition and things like that. He keeps trying to downplay these things and act like they were just tourists there that day, but that's obviously preposterous. So, he'll keep undermining his own campaign the way your commentators talked about previously. I'm pleased with the way Harris and Walz are focusing on issues I think American voters are more interested in hearing about, some of which you just touched on a few minutes ago, like the economy.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, stay on our track, and I don't know if they'll ever get on track themselves, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Should Governor Walz clarify some of the questions about his military career? Is that part of the campaign?
Yeah, I think he's talked about that some. My view so far is that, I think the focus has been on the use of the term war. The United States was at war essentially with, over in Afghanistan at the time. So I think it's factually correct on its face. But the larger piece, he was in, I think, the Guard for 24 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And
he left 2 months before his unit deployed to Iraq. They're saying that he abandoned his brothers in arms. That's a heavy charge.
It's a heavy charge. I think he left to run for Congress. I thought it was 10 months too, but maybe I've got the wrong number. But the bottom line is there's no indication of any kind of misconduct or stolen valor or anything along those lines. And when you contrast that with Donald Trump, who pretty much ducked out on service during the Vietnam era, he got the doctor in his father's building to give him bone spurs deferral.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that he
times,
can.
I believe.
Yeah, I don't know if he can cast the first stone. So,
well, you wonder if they're trying to encourage that debate, which would be curious, Congressman. I guess broadly, though, we're talking about, they're calling this the vibes campaign. There's this new energy that has changed the ground under our feet. You can speak to that as you wish. You're a Democrat. I'm sure you're very excited about what's happening. But have you ever seen a moment like this where an aircraft carrier of a presidential campaign turned on a dime?
No.
This has been in 2 weeks.
Yeah, this is pretty dramatic. And, the Obama campaign in 2008 had similar kinds of energy, but it took a long time for it to ramp up to that point. A little bit 1968, Bobby Kennedy, just as he was hitting his stride before he was assassinated. But that's kind of it in my recollection. And, I think she's doing a couple things with that are positive. One is she's sustaining it. It looks like the Walz pick. I know there were some people that wanted other selections, but it looks like it's worked out very well and sort of rallied the troops in any event, including, people who wanted other candidates to be picked. And I think she's also continuing to dominate the media. I think part of the reason Trump had the press conference yesterday was he's been sidelined in part by his own silly comments, but also because of the rise of her campaign. And I think he's trying to figure out a way to get back into it. They had Vance following them around for a couple of days, kind of nose pressed up against the window. Yeah, it was kind of funny. But, it's clear that they're a little desperate and confused about how to go forward.
Does she need to hold a news conference, do some of these interviews? That's the challenge right now, is that she's not answering questions.
Yeah, I don't mind, her doing that. I think it's there's going to be plenty of time for a variety of types of news conferences like that. But the introducing herself and her vice presidential candidate, I think, are the way to go right now. So I like the speeches in the battleground states. The big rallies make sense. Continuing to push the high energy events make a lot of sense. And, she can ride that out, I think, going forward.
I want to ask you about the Senate race in Maryland. You've endorsed Angela Alsobrooks, who's running against a Republican who's not talking a lot like a Republican. Larry Hogan, your former governor, is criticizing Donald Trump. He's very disappointed, he said, by the news conference. What we need to do is focus on the issues. He held a news conference, or an interview, I should say, rather, with Punchbowl. And he was talking about his opponent, Angela Alsobrooks, of course, Prince George's County executive who's running for an historic candidacy for Senate.
Right.
Larry Hogan said, my opponent really wants to make this about red versus blue. Just Democrat versus Republican. Probably take the names off the ballots and all of our records and say you have to vote blue. Our campaign, he says, is about red, white, and blue. Is there some truth to that?
Not on the ads that I've seen. The ads I've seen, he's running as a Democrat, basically. So he said, yesterday I saw one of his ads. It says choosing people over politics. Okay. Now that is the House Democrats' slogan for this cycle. That's
what we hear from Hakeem Jeffries.
Yeah, exactly. And then he talked about abortion.
So he's not a real Republican, is what you're saying.
Well, he certainly isn't running on their issues, and he's a million miles away from what Donald Trump's focus could be, I suppose, given what his commentaries have been. The problem is twofold. One is his record, which is, I think, more significant than what he's saying now. He was never supportive, particularly of abortion rights, and so he was able to get away with that because his races for governor occurred before Dobbs repealed Roe v. Wade. Now he can't do that, and the big problem he's got is that if he does get elected, he's already said he would sit with the Republican caucus. What that would mean is 51 votes. That has an impact on future Supreme Court selections, which certainly Democrats in Maryland are troubled by what Trump's done in the Supreme Court already. And then on the abortion issue, which there's a huge wing in the Republican Party that really wants to nationalize the bans that have taken place in some states. And then you get to gun violence and other issues along those lines where, the Republicans, for example, just on guns, ghost guns. You can't get one Republican co-sponsor to ban ghost guns in the House, which is crazy. I mean, the only reason you would have a ghost gun is if you want to evade prosecution because there's no serial numbers on
These are the guns with the serial numbers scratched.
That's right. The guns are made without serial numbers at all, just so that you can avoid prosecution. We can't get one Republican co-sponsor. He's not going to be able to duck those kinds of issues, I don't think, as we go forward.
As you consider all the questions you hear, the issues that arise from Oxon Hill, from your district, and now the need for money to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge, in our remaining moment, how are you going to get that done? Is that in the lame duck? Is it next year? How do you get that?
No, I think the push is to try and get it done now, and obviously what happens in November could have an impact on that in a very significant way.
Yeah.
We need to get the funding up front for the bridge because it's going to take years for the insurance cases.
So you need to get this done before the election, is your point?
Well, I'm saying that depending on who wins, I don't know what Trump would do if he gets elected.
That would jeopardize funding for the bridge, you think?
I think it could, yeah. I mean, there's some of the things that he's talked about and the Trump Project 2025, policy positions. We're talking about all kinds of radical changes. Another one, the House Republicans came out with a paper to eliminate building the new FBI headquarters and shut that down, even though we've been awarded that in Maryland.
That's right.
And try and move the whole thing to Alabama, which is like a little, little
thought
crazy.
they wanted to go to Quantico. Hang on a second. Congressman, I'm really glad you came in. We want to keep tabs with you, and I want to see you in Chicago. You're going to be at the DNC, right?
Absolutely. I look forward to seeing you there.
Let's make a plan. We'll meet right here on this program. Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland, Oxon Hill. As I said, we drive through the district every day on our way to work. We'll have a lot more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
8:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Best level of the day right now, a sudden jump for the S&P 500 index, up 25 points, up 0.5%. Last update, we told you stocks were mixed. Now they are higher across the board, with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and the NASDAQ 100 index all advancing. Again, the S&P up 25. That is an advance right now of 0.5%. The Dow up 99 points, up by 0.2%, while NASDAQ is higher by 80, a gain there of 0.5%. The 10-year at 3.94%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.04%. Gold up $7 the ounce, spot gold up 0.3%, $24.35 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.9%, $76.90 for a barrel of WTI. Big day yesterday for Bitcoin, up again today. Bitcoin now up by 1.5%. 60,417 on Bitcoin. Microsoft says a hacking group linked to the Iranian government tried to breach the email accounts of presidential campaign staffers as part of a wider effort to gather intelligence ahead of the U.S. election. Microsoft shares taking part in a broader tech advance today. We got Microsoft up now by 1%. So again, recapping, best level of the day right now with the S&P up 26, up by 0.5%. Balance of Power continues, the Friday edition. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Nice turn here. We started with the market turning lower an hour ago. We're back in the green in a different world than we were in on Monday. Thanks for joining on the fastest show in politics, with maybe not just one, not just two, but possibly 3 general election presidential debates looming. That's what it sounded like yesterday. Donald Trump said he cut a deal for 3. Multiple networks here. You had Fox and NBC. We already had ABC in the bag. Kamala Harris was asked about this idea on the tarmac yesterday. Here's what she said.
I'm glad that he's finally agreed to a debate on September 10th. I'm looking forward to it, and hope he shows up. I am happy to have that conversation about an additional debate for after September 10th, for sure.
All right, so maybe not 3, maybe 2. Originally here, right, we had September 10th planned on ABC. Donald Trump added one on the 4th and then one after. So look, we have to figure out a lot here. We need both campaigns to agree to these, but there will be a debate, it seems, and that's where we start with our panel. Jeannie Shanzano is here, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, and political science professor at Iona University, alongside Maura Gillespie, Republican strategist and founder of Blue Stack Strategies. Great again to have you both with us on our great panel here today. Jeannie, I'll start with you. Should Kamala Harris accept all 3 debates? Why not?
I think she should do the 10th, see how it goes. These are big stakes on both sides. It's a real test for both of them. And then she can decide how to respond. So I thought her response was fine. I think we can't forget that Kamala Harris has had something of a mixed record when it comes to debating. You can say that she's only vice president because of the way she debated during that one Democratic primary debate in 2020. So she has been effective, but she's also floundered in other areas. That said, she's grown as a candidate since then, but this is not in the bag for Kamala Harris. So I think it is going to be a test for both of them. And who knows? We just saw a debate change an entire election. So who knows what's in store for the 10th?
Isn't that the truth? Maura, I don't know your feelings on this. Donald Trump has clearly decided to just go for it, challenge her to as many debates as he can manage, having dispatched Joe Biden in a single debate. But not a lot was said about Donald Trump's performance that night outside of the mistruths, the way he conducted himself, the tone that he carried. Let's isolate Donald Trump's performance, and you tell me, should he be on the stage 3 times with Kamala Harris?
Well, what's interesting is that the Fox News debate that he had announced or tried to announce yesterday isn't what Fox News actually asked him for. They initially, I believe it was later in September, knowing that the September 10th ABC debate was already locked in. Donald Trump then decided to back out of it. Now he's back in, and he's trying to do a Fox News ahead of the ABC. So I think that that's also, again, Trump trying to take control of the situation, because he did come across as looking like he was scared to debate her, which is never something that Trump wants to be, characterized as scared. But I do think that when you look back at that debate, yes, obviously the takeaway was that Biden was not up for this, not only the candidacy of being president again, let alone being president for another 4 years, but Donald Trump lied so quickly and with such fervor that it was hard to really fact check in real time. And I do wish that ABC or somebody who is doing these debates would have a tracker at the bottom, with some sort of something like, X has, where you can do community notes. I think that in real time, people are being misled, and that's a disservice to the American public. But I do think that he is pretty confident in his debating ability, especially given the fact that Kamala Harris has not done any interviews yet. And, I understand her campaign as a communications staffer. I get that there is a, high risk, low reward situation about her doing interviews, but she's going to have to do something soon, and especially before she decides to go ahead and do these debates.
Yeah, let's get into that, Jeannie. This is becoming a thing. The fact that there's been no news conference, no big interview, and granted, it's been, 2-3 weeks, I guess, for this campaign. Does that need to happen before the debate? That's it's a month away. We're talking on September 10th. I know we've got a convention in the middle of that. But does this campaign need to start being more specific in getting Kamala Harris in front of reporters to answer hard questions?
I think so. She really does need to get out there, as does her running mate, Tim Walz. They both need to speak with reporters. It is not good practice to dodge them, and I'm not suggesting that's what she is doing. But this is something that effectively J.D. Vance and now yesterday Donald Trump put on the agenda, and now we're hearing more and more calls. So I suspect we will see her sit down. To your earlier point, maybe we see her sit down for a more softball interview first and then a more hardball interview. I think that is coming. The reality of this campaign has always been, though, the person who is on the hot seat, so to speak, the person who the campaign is about, is likely going to have a more difficult time. And that's what I think the Harris campaign is banking on. Let Donald Trump go out there with his press conferences for 90 minutes talking about, how great his room at Mar-a-Lago is, and talking about MLK. The more the focus is on him, the worse it is for his campaign, because he's simply not disciplined. And so, yes, she needs to talk. She also needs to keep going out with these big rallies and let Donald Trump be Donald Trump, because that is problematic for the GOP at the top of the ticket.
Maura, there are questions about the travel decisions inside the Trump campaign, with the Kamala Harris, Tim Walz camp hitting 6 swing states this week. They're adding Arizona and Nevada today. Donald Trump is in Bozeman, Montana. Then there are questions about ad spending. And this is really interesting, according to Politico, working with Ad Impact here. Donald Trump and allies still being outspent significantly in the battleground states specifically. Trump and allies spent $16.5 million over the first 5 days of August, compared with $23 million by Biden, Harris, and their allies. From the beginning of March to early August, Biden's side spent over $300 million compared with $110 million for Trump. Why are they waiting to put the money to work? Is it because it's not there?
No, I'm not sure if it's a matter of it not being there. I think, again, for a while now, Trump has felt like he had this in the bag. He also had a lot of legal issues that he still has to pay off and has to accommodate for. So I think it's a combination of things. And on the flip side, the Harris campaign, they've got to make up lost time, lost ground, and reintroduce themselves, not only introducing herself to the electorate, but also now introducing this new ticket. So they've got to amplify and ramp up their spending to make inroads in places like those swing states and the place that they think is viable to win. And so maybe it's a combination of those things. I also think Trump just kind of feels like he's got this still, even though I think he is a bit rattled by what's happening with Harris and the polls. I think maybe post-convention of the DNC, then you'll see an uptick in things, but because you're always going to see an uptick for whoever's convention is happening at the time. So maybe, after the 25th of August, we see a big September spend by the Trump campaign. But I think it's a combination of things, not directly Bozeman, Montana is a great place to be right now, this time of year, but I think that it's not necessarily thought out in that way.
Beautiful this time of year. Douglas, listening to us today on Bloomberg, sends a tweet. Are you banned from discussing RFK? Why is he not on your program? If you're from Freedom of Choice, talk about RFK on your show. Now's your chance, Douglas. Jeannie, RFK Jr. got a big old endorsement yesterday from none other than Joe Rogan, who has 14.5 million followers on Spotify. Quote, he's the only one that makes sense to me, unquote. Joe Rogan on his Joe Rogan Experience podcast. This is a campaign, Jeannie, that some folks thought might be coming to an end. Does this breathe new life into it?
It very well could. And thank you, Douglas, because I love talking about RFK Jr., as you know, Joe Matthew. But
I know you do.
But yeah, this is big. Joe Rogan's audience is huge. I think it's probably a bit concerning more to the Trump side than the Harris side in terms of who he might eat some support from. I, too, have family members who are big RFK Jr. supporters. He's dipping a bit in the polls since Kamala Harris ascended. But as he is on the ballots in some key states, he's got to be somebody who we pay attention to. And so Rogan coming out for him, I think, is a big move and something, again, I think that may be why, by the way, we see Trump with Elon Musk on Monday. If we do, you got to counter Rogan with somebody, and who better than Elon Musk?
Fascinating. I've only got 30 seconds. I'll apologize in advance, Maura. Is this disruptive to the Trump camp?
Absolutely. People who are listening to Joe Rogan have also expressed, interest in Donald Trump. Joe Rogan himself has also talked about Donald Trump in favorable ways. So I definitely think it pulls from his side, given his support of RFK Jr.
This is a very interesting wrinkle and something that we will keep tabs on. Douglas, don't worry. There's more where this came from. Great panel. Thank you both. Jeannie Shanzano, Maura Gillespie. Fascinating insights, as always, here on Balance of Power. We're going to turn our attention to geopolitics coming up. There's a lot to talk about there that's not getting the attention it deserves in mainstream media when it involves Ukraine, when it involves Israel. Stay with us after we check world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Russia has declared a federal-level emergency in the Kursk region after a large-scale incursion from Ukraine. It sent reinforcements there today, 4 days after hundreds of Ukrainian troops poured across the border in what appeared to be Kyiv's biggest attack on Russian soil since the war began. Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
You're seeing some of these cross-border counterfire measures that they're being able to take that are near the border of Ukraine. We don't support long-range attacks into Ukraine. We've said that from the very beginning. I'm not going to draw, a circular map here for you of where they can and can't strike, but we've been very clear with the Ukrainians.
Ukraine said it carried out a drone strike on a military airfield in Russia's western region. Flood warnings and watches still stretching from Georgia to New Hampshire. Heavy rain warnings are up in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. Post-tropical cyclone Debbie tracking all across the eastern U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden making their first trip together since the president's decision to drop out of the race. They'll appear together at an event in Maryland next week. Summer Games wrapping up this weekend. The U.S. has the most medals at 104. China has the most gold medals with 32. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
9:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. U.S. stocks holding close to session highs. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green. The S&P right now up by 36 points, up by about 0.7%. A wild week in markets wrapping up with subdued action in stocks after a surge in volatility that unsettled investors. Following its biggest rally in almost 2 years, the S&P 500 index up another 0.7% today. The Dow up 135, up 0.3%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is up 123 points, up now by 0.7%. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares in the green, up by about 0.1%. We've got the 10-year yielding 3.94%, with the 2-year now at 4.05%. Spot gold higher by $5 the ounce. Spot gold $24.33 the ounce, up by about 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil WTI up 0.7%, 76.73 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, also higher, up by 0.4%, 79.53. Cannot ignore Bitcoin again today. It surged yesterday. Bitcoin up by another 1.8% right now at 60,584. Getting word from General Motors that Marissa West has decided to leave the automaker only 8 months after taking the job overseeing North American operations, which is its most profitable business. General Motors shares, they are advancing today. We have got GM shares up by about 2.5%. Cisco Systems is cutting thousands of jobs, and a second round of layoffs is here. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Reuters says the number of people affected could be similar or slightly higher than the 4,000 employees that Cisco laid off in February. Those cuts likely to be announced as early as Wednesday, according to Reuters. Again, we've got Cisco Systems trading lower, down 0.3%. This on a day when we are seeing technology shares advance. The NASDAQ 100 index right now up by about 0.7%. And cannot ignore the move in Sweetgreen shares today. The stock rallying after the salad chain posted sales that outpaced market expectations. It also raised its outlook for the full year. Sweetgreen shares, they are up now by 28.7%. So again, recapping here, we have got the Dow, the S&P and NASDAQ very much in the green. The S&P up 0.5%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Lots going on in the markets, and indeed lots going on in politics. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, we do thank you. Remarkable to see this turn, Charlie, to the positive. This bouncing around today is really indicative, I guess, of the volatility that we've seen all week, but still feeling a lot more stable than we did on Monday when people were talking about a recession on this market falling apart.
Earlier in the week, we did have the VIX pushing above 60. Looking at a VIX right now, a measure of volatility at just about 21. But certainly, at least in today's trading, there is a sentiment that perhaps the worst might have passed, just in terms of the volatility. Maybe things will calm down over the weekend. Also next week, not a big week for earnings, but next week also some key inflation data too.
That's true. CPI day next Wednesday, Charlie. You and I are going to have a lot to talk about that, and I thank you so much for taking us by the hand this week through a very complex market when we consider the cross currents here, the carried trade in the throes of earnings season against the backdrop of weakening data. This is why you listen to and watch Bloomberg every day. Right,
and indeed, too, I just got to say, just in terms of the political developments this week, the comments from Donald Trump about the independence of the Federal Reserve, a lot going on in the political arena as well.
No, that's not going away anytime soon. Pretty remarkable to think that in 1 week we're on our way to Chicago, and we're going to be bringing you special coverage of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago with so many issues flying around this campaign, whether it's the economy, abortion, the border, or, yes, geopolitics. And we hear a lot about how voters tend not to key their decisions off geopolitical stories, but foreign policy might well make the grade, considering 2 hot wars underway right now. Not only Ukraine, but great questions about our policy in Israel. And you know that, of course, is swirling around the Harris campaign with the potential now for a ceasefire. I know you've heard me say this before, but we're following parallel storylines today in Israel. One is the anticipated retaliation from Iran over the killings of Hezbollah and Hamas officials. The other is the potential for a ceasefire with Hamas. with reporting today that the president, leaders of Egypt and Qatar say they are prepared to present a final ceasefire proposal. If you're reading the terminal, you see that new round of ceasefire talks now set for August 15th. Very important as we add the voice of Mara Rudman, professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, director of the Ripples of Hope Project, focused on democratic solutions. Mara, it's great to have you back. I don't know how you have both of these stories existing at once. And I'm going to point you to one more headline that crossed the terminal a short time ago from Reuters. Biden to lift offensive weapons sales ban to Saudi Arabia. When you factor that in, are we on the verge of a ceasefire breakthrough?
We've been at this point before, as you've noted. Everything is possible, which means that I would say we're at an inflection point. We can be moving toward the ceasefire, and those are key meetings next week, August 15th. It's also significant that Qatar, Egypt, and the United States together put out the statement about pushing for the August 15th meeting and about presenting a bridging proposal. At the same time, it's very unclear what Iran will be doing, what Hezbollah's calculations are. And so the next several days are just critical.
That's for sure. I just don't get, and maybe I'm being a little too simple here, Mara, how you can strike a ceasefire while Israel is also bracing for a potential retaliation from Iran. Are you thinking that won't happen?
No, I think that the two are actually interlinked. I'm going to bring you back to something that Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was so tragically assassinated by some of the very people related to folks in Bibi Netanyahu's cabinet. But Prime Minister Rabin used to talk about fighting for peace as if there was no war, and fighting wars as if there was no peace. And living in that combined space at the same time is typical not just for this region, but for many conflicts where you've got to look for ways to talk and to get to resolution. And at the same time, you've got to be prepared to fully defend yourself.
Mm-hmm. We remember, of course, what happened in April when Iran did respond. And the refrain that we've heard across the spectrum is that Hezbollah is not looking for a wider war. Iran is not looking for a wider war. And of course, Israel is not. Do you believe that to be true?
Yes, I believe that all of the actors, for a variety of reasons, recognize that a wider war is not in their interest. Sadly, in this kind of situation, that doesn't always mean that their actions will not trigger that wider war. And the role of the United States, in this case also of Egypt, Qatar, of the Saudis, of everyone else in the region and throughout the world, is to try to stress that longer term perspective, to try to keep folks away from the trigger finger, so to speak, and to give incentives to the fullest extent possible to reach for what is in everyone's long-term interest, which is to avoid this tit for tat now.
Well, we're at a moment where a lot could happen here. And we remember May 31st, the day that Joe Biden addressed the nation, the world, from the White House with a 6-point ceasefire plan that he said Israel had signed off on. We saw, of course, in the days following that Benjamin Netanyahu may have signed off on something in principle, but was clearly not on board with the details at hand. Why should the White House trust him now?
So the White House is working with the state of Israel, and it's working as well with Qataris and Egyptians who are working with Hamas. The challenge that all of those who are trying to bring about the ceasefire face is that there are elements for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, where any kind of ceasefire agreement is not in their direct, immediate political interest. And yet, for many of the people around them, in the case of Bibi Netanyahu, frankly, his entire military and security establishment, as well as the people of Israel, certainly the families of hostages, are pushing very hard for the nature and scoping of the ceasefire proposal that has been laid out. And in the case of Hamas, it's not just the countries around. Many Palestinians in Gaza are brave enough, courageous enough to speak out on the record about the challenges and how much they need a ceasefire, which takes a tremendous amount of risk and peril for them, given the vicious kind of leadership of Yahya Sinwar.
Mm-hmm. We've been surging military assets into the region even more than we already had. Mara, F-22 jets now included, several more destroyers in the region. What are we planning for? What are we prepared to do to defend Israel if this retaliatory strike does come?
Well, what we've put into the region is certainly a show of force, and part of a strong deterrence, the strongest deterrence you can mobilize is to show the willingness to be able to defend and to help defend. And so that is part of what is going on right now. Certainly the United States showing with what you've described, what we are willing to bring into the region to help Israel defend itself, and any number of private conversations that are going on with players throughout the region, as was reported earlier today, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Egyptians, others are all talking to Iran as well about scaling this back, about the longer term interests of everyone in the region. Jordanians have been clear about not using their airspace for either side, frankly, which is part of, I think, how the kingdom there is trying to position itself to, again, damp down actions that could really result in tragedy across the region.
Fast forward to August 15th, again, the ceasefire talks that have been scheduled, the U.S., Qatar, Egypt. Is this Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or is this Bill Burns at the table for the United States? Do we know?
It's probably a combination. I think that Bill Burns has been the primary leader of this effort, of the behind the scenes. I think that Brett McGurk, who's at the White House at the NSC, works for Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is very much kind of day-to-day hands-on, but Bill Burns clearly has a whole team as well, and I'm sure that Secretary Blinken is also very much involved. So it is a full team effort.
August 15th is next Thursday. Mara, what's more likely in that time? That we do have a breakthrough on a ceasefire, or Iran strikes Israel?
I don't want to put odds on that kind of situation. Honestly, what I try to remain focused on is what's so clearly in the United States' interest, in Israel's interest, in the interests of all those in the region, and absolutely for the hostages and their families, which is to reach a ceasefire deal. And doing so is obviously going to be much more possible in the near term if there are not actions by Hezbollah or by Iran in this intervening time period, which will certainly escalate and make a ceasefire that much more difficult.
Yeah, I only have a minute left here, Mara. We're in the throes of an important election here in the United States. To what extent would a Trump presidency embrace this ceasefire proposal? I'm assuming Kamala Harris would be in continuity with Joe Biden.
I think that's correct in terms of all signs that Kamala Harris has given. And in terms of a Trump administration, really, who knows? He has been all over the place on this issue. He was quite harsh to Israel and to the prime minister immediately after October 7th in a way that was surprising to people. He's also talked in ways he's not a negotiator, despite his let's make a deal kind of aura, the President Trump. He's not used to how you create win-win situations as opposed to zero sum. And this is a situation where you've got to figure out ways to get through that lead to a ceasefire deal. So I'm very concerned, perhaps not surprisingly, about how a Trump administration might handle what is going on now and kind of any future in the region.
From the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, Mara Rudman. It's great to have you back, Mara. Thank you so much for the insights at another very important moment here in geopolitics. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us. Coming up on the late edition of Balance of Power, Amy Walter from the Cook Political Report, and the latest in my series on wine in Washington. We'll focus on the pronounced movement of women rising into prominent roles in the wine world, including women like Jessica Liberto Husseini, we sat down with, runs the wine program at the Michelin-starred restaurant The Dabney.
Democrats and Republicans have different preferences when it comes to wine?
Everybody has different preferences. No.
So you're not going to tell me the Republicans all order the big cabs and Democrats come and ask for a rosé?
No. Okay. I'll tell you, on the last time she was here, RBG drank Sancerre on her birthday. multiple bottles. And then before dessert, went home because she was tired.
I bet that happens from time to time here.
To the best of us. Meet us in the wine cellar, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, the late edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Masser, along with my partner in crime this week.
I'm still here.
He's still here. Matt Miller is with me, in for Tim Stenevec. Tim will be back on Monday. You know, we kicked off the trading day, you and I, on TV with a bit of a whimper, and we actually are up on the day.
Yeah, riding up into the close. I mean, let's not oversell it, right? We're looking at 0.5% gains on the S&P, less than 0.5% gains on the NASDAQ.
It's still
the Dow Jones Industrial Average
whimperish.
unchanged. Yeah, but you know what? It's better than a stick in the eye, as my first stockbroker used to always tell me.
Seriously?
A little too often, he said that. Yeah.
Stick in the eye.
So, the thing is, there hasn't been any of the crazy volatility today.
No.
Yes, we were down. Yes, we're up, but it's not like multiple percentage point swings. So this is the first day this week that we've seen that.
VIX at 21, though, still kind of hovering around that level. So way off of where we saw it on Monday, but nonetheless not back down to some of those kind of mid to high teens that we've been seeing a lot this year. All right, we're going to get into the markets, guys. We're going to talk about the week that was in rates. We're also going to find out what the world's biggest active bond fund manager has to say about it all. Plus, sweet. And it's not what you think it is, Matt.
Yes. Well, I thought you were talking about candy, but you're talking about salad. And they're like opposite ends of the spectrum. Sweet Green knocked it out of the park with sales. I think same-store sales were up 9%.
Pretty impressive.
9%.
Yeah, that's called pretty good.
Yeah.
That's called sweet.
Well, and that's why the shares are now up 20% from the IPO. They had been down until now.
You're going to give us some context later because the stock right from the IPO. Also, the swing state economic realities that are shaping the U.S. election. We got a lot coming your way in the next 60 minutes. First up, though, waiting patiently, as he always does, Charlie Pellet with a check on the trade. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed. We have that talking about Sweet Green. That stock up today by 29.5%, ripping higher. Stocks do remain higher at the end of a dizzying week. The market, though, wiping out just about all of the losses from that Monday's sell-off that rattled trading around the world. As it stands right now, the S&P 500 index on the week is down by about 0.1%. If we do close lower, that would mean the fourth weekly drop for the S&P 500 index. But right now, stocks are advancing. S&P 500 index up 0.5%. The Dow up 34 points, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up 88, up by about 0.5%. 10-year at 3.93%. The 2-year 4.05%. Gold up 0.1%, 24.29 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.6%, 76.68 for a barrel of WTI. Job cuts, lots of them. Stellantis, the owner of the Jeep and Ram brands, plans to eliminate as many as 2,450 hourly positions at a pickup truck factory located near Detroit. And this morning reports that Cisco is going to be cutting thousands of jobs in a second round of layoffs this year. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Cisco right now down by about 0.4%. Again, recapping, U.S. stocks are holding on to gains right now. 2 hours to go ahead of the closing bell with the S&P up 23, up 0.4%. Sweet Green, we're going to be talking about that. Sweet Green up now by 30.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Talking the equity trade, looking at a 2-year note, just above 4%, and you've got a 10-year just below it. I mean, the week that was when it comes to rates, go back to Monday, Matt, and rates had come down so much as we saw a tremendous bond rally, but a very different thing today.
Yeah, and I actually heard Gina Martin Adam on Bloomberg Radio this morning around 5 a.m. saying that it was really the bond trade that moved the equity markets.
That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, especially since, the kickoff or the original trigger was the Bank of Japan raising rates and the Fed saying last Wednesday, okay, we're going to start cutting rates.
Right, exactly. And then we got into the carry trade and the impact of that. Meantime, I do want to point out Fed policymakers have pushed back on the need for aggressive actions following that weaker than expected jobs report in July when hiring slowed markedly and the unemployment rate rose to the highest level in nearly 3 years. That was certainly something that started stewing all of this. We wanted to bring back Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie. He has been with us on a journey, I feel like, this past week and through the volatility that we've seen.
Sat with us through Trump yesterday.
He did.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. All right. He also caught up with Dan Ivison, the world's biggest active bond fund manager. He talked about it a little bit yesterday. Michael joins us. Michael, 2-year back at 4%, 10-year just below it. Very different trade on Monday. How are you thinking about kind of where we're ending up here on Friday versus where we were and the mood and the sentiment on Monday?
Well, we clearly overshot in terms of yields falling on Monday, given all the chaos that was unfolding out of Japan and with the carry trade. And I think as we spoke earlier in the week, I said, this is a market that was worried that there could be something unraveling, a big trade going wrong, some kind of systemic issue. That hasn't come to pass. So effectively, the yields have come back. But I think what's interesting at the moment is that this bond market still expects 100 basis points of cuts by the end of the year. So that's double what the Fed's been telling us. And we're also, while the 2-year yield is back over 405, around 405%, it's below where it was before we went into Friday's jobs number. So this is a bond market that's still leaning towards we're going to see more weakness in the labor market statistics, and therefore there is a need for the Fed to move. And I think we're going to see, if we look ahead to next week, we've got CPI and retail sales. They'll be important. But I think this is a market that's really going to be focusing more on weekly jobless claims, which is what we saw yesterday. And of course, the big monthly payroll report that comes out the first week of September.
But we're not expecting to see moves the likes of which, Jeremy Siegel, for example, on Monday was calling for a 75 basis point emergency rate cut and then another 75 basis points at the meeting on September 18th. Meanwhile, in a survey of economists, we found actually 4 out of 5 economists, so the vast majority in our survey said it's only going to be 25 basis points.
Sure, and I think the response to the bond market is, and again, this is kind of something that Dan Iverson at PIMCO told me earlier this week, we do know in past cycles when employment starts to go, it can go very, very quickly. We do have a Fed that has been signaling of late that they are focusing on the dual mandate, not only inflation, but also labor. Chair Powell last week told us during the press conference that there were real downside risks to labor. This is what's got the bond market on edge here. And this is why they're sort of pushing ahead, because you're not going to benefit from a big drop in rates if you wait for the data. So you're having to sort of roll the dice a little bit. It's a probability. What do we think are the odds of a harder landing potentially beginning to come through to fruition? And this is why the market is still pricing in 100 basis points of cuts. Now, if you get a solid payroll report for August, the first week of September, then this market will have to reprice, and it could be pretty nasty.
But by the way, do we see, in your experience, and Michael, you've been at this for a long time, do we see layoffs come fast and quick when they do come, or is it a trickle? I mean, does unemployment rise on an elevator or an escalator?
It tends to rise on the elevator. I mean, that's what's really interesting when you do look at past cycles. The unemployment rate starts to get going. And so a lot of people have been talking this week that unemployment is, I mean, if we look at the current rate of unemployment at 4.3%, that exceeds the median set forecast from the Fed officials themselves for this year, next year, and the following year. So we're already moving beyond what the Fed was signaling just back in June would be a likely the correct call for unemployment. So it's moving ahead of what the Fed was thinking as recently as June.
How difficult is this moment for the Federal Reserve, or do you think it's very clear? And I guess I'm thinking about historically when you get to the point where you're ready to go in a different direction when it comes to monetary policy. How tricky and difficult is it, Michael, to getting it right? And
this is always, there's a reason why we only really had one soft landing, and that was in 95. Soft landings are extremely rare because ultimately the Fed does overdo it. If you look at the prime borrowing rate at the moment, it's sitting at 8.5%. Now, inflation adjusted, that's around 6%. That's really tough for a lot of small and medium-sized companies. And this is why, with the Fed having been on hold for a year now, the yield curve is now coming back to, this week it briefly got turned positive. But typically when the yield curve becomes positive and really starts to trend, that's when the bond market says we are in recession and the Fed is really behind the curve. So at the moment, you could sort of say we're kind of poised here on the precipice. We don't know whether we are going to be tumbling down. We don't know whether we can still stay here. And that's where the position the Fed finds itself in. It's why they keep saying we're data dependent. But into the mix, of course, is that we do know labor is a lagging indicator. And this is why the bond market is feeling pretty confident, I think. They've had a lot of pivots which have backfired spectacularly over the last year and a half. But I think in this case, they are pretty confident that labor is slowing. And it really is a question of just how much does it slow? And then for the Fed, they're having to grapple with that as well. And the Fed officials do know from history, they have been behind the curve ultimately, which is why when they do start to cut, they tend to cut pretty quickly.
I wonder, I was thinking about our survey of economists, and I was then wondering if market strategists feel the same way. Do you see like a tug of war between the market strategist calls and the economist calls at big banks?
yes, there's always if you think there's tension between the Fed and markets, there's a lot of tension on any trading floor between the house view, the economists, and what the desk traders in rates are saying and doing. That's always been the way. And I can remember back in 2007, this was very evident. You had some people really pushing. I mean, I remember actually sitting down with PIMCO in the summer of 2007, and one of their leading managers said to me, there is a housing bubble, it's blowing up. We've gone out to all the sand states, and we're seeing it. We are fully positioned for a big recession. And the economists at the time are saying, there's nothing to worry here. And of course, the S&P hit a record high on October 31st, 2007. We all know what happens. So this is why the bond market has this sort of feel. And it's why economists obviously look to their models. They're trying to sort of gauge where things are. I think the real difference is that, in a way, the dot plot is a bit of a problem because it's a very static point, whereas the bond market, it's rolling this distribution of probabilities. And that moves on every little piece of data that comes in. And it gets amplified by things when the yen carry trade suddenly hits the skids. And then everyone says, oh, I've got to buy bonds because equities are getting hit now. And bonds are a good defensive thing to own. The only thing I will say too here is that we had a poor auction for 10 years this week and for 30s. But this 10-year is holding in around 4%, just a little bit below 4%. 4%, if you go back to looking at the charts since 2007, 4% is a really good level. Right? If you're a long-term investor and you think, should I sort of have some bonds here to offset my equity portfolio? And on the other question, of course, one really interesting thing that's come out this week is that if you look at the 10-year inflation-adjusted yield, known as the real yield, that's still hanging around 2%. And talking to an investor this morning, he said, this is the bond market telling the Fed they're too tight and they are at risk of a policy mistake. So keep an eye on that real yield, because I think that's going to be an important thing to watch over the next couple of weeks as we get some of this more important data.
Hey, Michael, we'd be remiss not to ask you, just got about 20, 30 seconds here. You did catch up with Dan Ivison. You mentioned it yesterday. Just your key takeaway from that conversation.
I think the key takeaway was you want to own bonds because it's going to get pretty rocky between here and now. We're getting towards the end of a late cycle dynamic. We don't know how things are going to unfold. And like a lot of other investors, he was long going into the last couple of weeks. He's lined up, but he's ready to buy the dip if we get a big enough backup in rates.
All right, great stuff as always. Hey, listen, have a great weekend, I should say, and thanks for giving us a great week with all of your analysis. Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie. All right, let's get to the equity trade. And despite kind of small moves in the equity trade, there is one name that really stands out, Matt, Sweet Green.
Yeah, absolutely. Soaring up 30%. And, you know, before this, for months and months, maybe years, this is a company that has been down. If you bought it at the IPO, you've been underwater for a long time.
It's a good point, right?
Yeah.
Like it's still trying to catch up there. Hey, listen, let's talk about it because the company did come out and post sales that outpaced market expectations. They raised their outlook for the full year. Let's get into it. Bloomberg News consumer reporter Dina Shanker joining us in New York out there in Westchester. So Dina, I mean, whoa. I mean, this was a pretty big quarter here.
Yeah, Sweet Green just doing really well, but they're not alone. The fast casual category has just been, winning when the QSR category has been losing. People really like salads for lunch and increasingly for dinner.
So why has the stock done so poorly? Is it just that they priced it too aggressively at the IPO? Because, you know, right now, even with these gains, they're only up 21% since that IPO, which was at the end of 2021. Meanwhile, Kava, which IPO'd much more recently, has quadrupled since it started trading.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Sweet Green has one really big problem, which is that they're not profitable at the moment. So that might be playing a role here as well. But they see a bright future, not just because people keep coming into their stores even when they're skipping other restaurant options, but also they are really bullish on automation being a big driver for them for serving more people at lower costs.
How could you not be profitable when you're charging $17 for a salad?
Something you have written about.
Yeah, well, food costs more than it used to, and the truth is that all that labor that it takes to make those salads is also increasingly in short supply and getting more expensive. But that gap between what a salad at Sweetgreen costs and a combo meal at a fast food restaurant that isn't on one of their $5 meals, like that gap is getting really small. And so you're seeing a lot of people just think about the price in a different way. And just sort of a bigger picture, I think consumers today value their health more than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So spending a lot of money on lunch doesn't seem so crazy. And also dinner is an increasingly important day part for all these fast casual restaurant chains. You know, $17 sounds like a lot maybe for lunch, but does it for dinner? What if it comes with steak, which they've added to their menu? So Sweetgreen has found, you know, a loyal customer base, and $17 for a great salad with the added convenience that you can eat it alone at your desk. Maybe that really helps.
The added convenience that you could eat it sad and lonely at your desk. What a benefit. I actually do it. I
don't mind doing that.
I do it every
and
day.
I
have to say, I do it every day.
I gotta say, I love their kale Caesars. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say there's something, you know, intimate about sitting alone at your computer eating your salad, and then when somebody bothers you and they're like, and it's like, excuse me.
Get out of my space.
This is my lunch 15 minutes. We used to have a lunch hour, but now you get that 15 minutes and you have a really delicious salad that doesn't make you tired and sluggish for the rest of the afternoon.
Quick question, Dina, on Potbelly. I don't know how closely you follow the company, but we talked with the CEO earlier. Their chart looks the opposite to Sweetgreen. Sweetgreen is like convex and Potbelly is concave. It's gone up and then come back down. So what's the story with the sandwich shop?
We've just got about 30 seconds.
What I would just say is that consumers and investors are fickle, and it is really difficult to figure out exactly what's going on with any of these. But, you know, Potbelly plays outside that QSR market, but they're not quite in that salad chain either, clearly. So it's just every chain has a different arc. Or concave or convex.
They're not always apples to apples, I will say. But it was interesting, I feel like, from all of the two CEOs that we talked to, Car Guru and Potbelly, consumers are definitely looking for some value. Dina Shanker, so appreciate it. Consumer reporter at Bloomberg News. Coming up, we're going to talk about swing states and their economies in the election.
2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got a choppy session. Stocks do remain higher. The S&P up by 15 right now, back at 53.35. We're well off session highs, but still looking at a gain of 0.3%. Dow Industrials trading lower by 8 points. Little change there in the red. NASDAQ is higher by 58 points for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain now of just about 0.4%. 10-year yield 3.94% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.05%. Gold a little changed, up 79 cents the ounce to $24.28, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 0.8%, 76.79 per barrel of WTI. Sweetgreen shares are surging after the salad chain posted sales that outpaced market expectations. It also did raise its outlook for the full year. Sweetgreen right now trading higher by just about 29%. Again, recapping, S&P 500 index up 17, up by about 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Matt Miller helps if I turn on
Push the blue button.
Push the blue button. You know, it's been quite a week, and sometimes you forget to push the blue button. Hey, for all the turbulence that has shaken the U.S. presidential contest this summer, voters have been consistent in saying the economy is their top election issue, but the economy that matters most is not national. This is important. It's in the 7 swing states poised to decide the race. We talk about the swing states a lot, Matt.
But we don't talk about this a lot. To me, this was pretty much new information.
It explains kind of so much.
And the way that these guys broke it down, I think, was unbelievably helpful. Like, they should work for the campaign.
Hint, hint. All right. This is today's Bloomberg Big Take, which is a story that our editorial team has deemed a must-read. It is among our most read stories on the Bloomberg. It's by a handful of reporters, including Bloomberg News senior economics writer Sean Donnan in our Washington, D.C. bureau. And then right here in our studio, we've got Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist. Great to have you here with us both. As Matt said, a great story. Makes, I think, a lot makes sense in terms of the concerns among U.S. voters. Sean laid out for us what you guys set out to do and how you did it.
Yeah, look, our goal here was understanding, what was happening in the economy in swing states. As you said there, poll after poll shows voters nominating the economy as their top issue. We also know that voters in the 7 swing states are the ones that are really going to decide this election in November in all likelihood. And so we wanted to know the economy that they lived in. And what we found was some pretty, to me, was surprising new information. The first of which was just, we think of these 7 swing states as a kind of disparate family. Sometimes they're thought of being at the fringe of American politics or the American economy. But when you put them all together, it's 61 million people who live in a $4.4 trillion economy that would be the world's 4th largest and is up there with Germany and Japan in terms of scale. The second thing that we found that is also really important to think about is that economy is one that's been growing more slowly out of the pandemic recession than the rest of the United States. In fact, it grew at 2/3 the rate of the rest of the U.S.
Yep. Yeah. To me, the headline is, if you look at the economies in the swing states, the results are no bueno for the Democrats. Just because, Harris is going to pick up Biden's legacy, and these states have not only grown at a slower pace than the rest of America, but if you break it down by counties, most of the people live in counties that have done worse than even the state. Like, I look at Erie, which you headline or you point out in the story has seen a GDP per capita drop between 2019 and 2022, and everybody's just like moving out of there. But if you look at the counties across Pennsylvania, 40% of the people live in counties where GDP has fallen. So, Stuart, it's going to be hard for Harris and for the Dems to spin this.
It is. So much of politics is local, so much of investment is local, so much of infrastructure spending is local. And when you look even at the places where there's been a lot of investment in manufacturing, some of the stories are so unique and specific. So one of the major swing states where we've seen growth in manufacturing is Nevada. But a lot of that is really just a very specific story about manufacturing of Tesla's batteries. And so how much that resonates with voters who are experiencing a dramatic surge in the cost of housing, for example, and Sean has done some amazing reporting around the cost of housing, it's difficult to see those sort of economic developments resonating positively with voters, at least as it pertains to Harris on the ticket.
I got to say, Sean, one of the stats, and when you talk about Nevada, this particular county said, you guys include this stat, in 2019, a typical household in Nevada could expect to spend almost 20% of its income on mortgage payments if they purchased a median-priced home. That rose to almost 37% last year, according to calculations by Bloomberg Economics. I mean, how do you survive? How do you live?
Welcome to New York, Nevada.
Well, right, yeah. But I mean, this is a story we keep telling over and over here at Bloomberg.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And housing costs are, we talk about inflation a lot and the impact on consumers, but housing costs, which are related to interest rates as well as the value of properties, starter homes now are going for just, an incredible multiple of what they used to. And that is true in a place like Nevada. I mean, Reno, Nevada, where I was, it was one of these places that is a kind of hopeful story about new manufacturing and economic transformation. The local economy there in Washoe County, where it sits, has been growing in population. A lot of people moving there from California and so on. But housing prices have gone through the roof, and that has started to dislocate a lot of people there locally. So, I spent some time at Catholic Charities talking to the folks who work there and work with people who are struggling to make rent. And one of the things she says is what they're seeing is not just, people who are homeless. What they're seeing people who have good jobs and well-paid jobs, $25 an hour jobs, who can't afford to make rent because rents have been going up so much.
So the Nevada story is one of inflation that they're going to blame on Biden. Erie County is one on an exodus of manufacturing that they're going to blame on Biden. You get to Fuller County. I thought this was fascinating. In Georgia, they've seen per capita GDP increase 16% from 19 to 22. Population's up 14%, but they hate Democrats so much that they pretend the economy sucks. Like, how do you explain that away, Stuart?
It's difficult. So when you have a surge in population, you try to get those folks integrated into the economy as quickly as possible so that they can be productive, they can generate a lot of economic growth. But when the nominal growth that you've seen is about the same as the population growth that you've seen, you don't realize any improvement in your standard of living at all. And that's basically the story of what's going on. And frankly, it's a sad story. You want people to get integrated into the economy. You want standards of living to improve. And they're just not going to be feeling it, despite the fact that they've seen this influx of people that should help to buoy growth.
I want to go back to you, Sean, in a moment, but Sean is a master at doing these kinds of stories, taking us, to the granular level, the ground level, in terms of telling us what's going on across the United States, really getting to real stories. Stuart, working on this story with the team and with Sean, as an economist, we often talk, government numbers, big numbers, and so on and so forth. What did you kind of find out?
What really gets interesting is when you do the head-to-head comparisons for Trump and Biden so far in this administration. Vice President Harris is going to be painted with the same brush as President Biden, especially if she wants to take credit for any sort of the employment growth and the low unemployment, generally low unemployment, that they've seen during this administration. It's really a story of the cumulative inflation and comparing cumulative inflation across the swing states, across the presidencies. If you look, there's only one swing state that's had lower inflation than the U.S. as a whole. 6 of the 7 swing states have seen the same or more inflation than the rest of the country. And to look at Wisconsin, where they've had lower inflation than the rest of the country, it's really a story of an economy that's in decline at the state level more broadly. You look at the rest of the swing states, Arizona, Nevada, where they've seen dramatic inflation, and that's way worse than the rest of the country, you would imagine that that's going to be a problem for Vice President Harris. And if you just zoom out to the national level and you think cumulative inflation under Biden is going to end up being about 21, 22% during his 4-year term in office. people are going to remember that during Trump's time in office, there was just cumulative inflation of about 8%. And that's the thing that matters most. It's literally a pocketbook issue. How much is the money in your pocketbook going to buy you?
So they think they would be better off with Trump because you didn't have the sort of post-COVID inflation during his presidency. Sean, what can the Harris Walz campaign do? Like, can they cancel their student debt? Can they buy them beer? Like, what can they do to get these voters back?
So one of the really fascinating things, in particular this week, as Vice President Harris and Tim Walz have been touring swing states, is to listen how the economic message has changed, right? She is much more about what is happening to households and promising a better future. She's promising to bring down prices. She's talking about corporate price gouging. Those are her words. She is trying to offer hope for the future, whereas when President Biden was touring and campaigning, the message you heard was much more about, look, the American economy is the envy of the world. It's had an incredible recovery from the pandemic recession. I hear this all the time when I go to the G7 and so on. And that was a message that just did not resonate with voters. And we saw it in poll after poll. And so we're seeing the Democrats adjust on the fly. But, look, the broad point here is also that there is a disparity between what economists and markets look at, and those are the big national numbers in terms of the economy, and the local numbers. And it's the local numbers that matter in politics and continue to matter. We learned that in 2016, both here in the U.S., when we saw the election of Donald Trump, and people started talking about those left behind places in America. We saw it in the U.K. when we saw Brexit in 2016.
Right.
We got to remember that lesson here in 2024.
Really important. Explains so much, certainly, in terms of some of the voter dissatisfaction that's out there. Hey, guys, thank you. Incredible read. Bloomberg News senior economics writer Sean Donnan, Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist. Check out, and you can read more of the Bloomberg Big Take. It's on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/Big Take. All right, let's stay in D.C. where Sean is and get back to world and national news and Amy Morris. Amy, all yours.
Thank you, Carol. Russia declared a federal-level emergency in the Kursk region after a large-scale incursion from Ukraine. It sent reinforcements there today, 4 days after hundreds of Ukrainian troops poured across the border in what appeared to be Kyiv's biggest attack on Russian soil since the war began. Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
They are taking actions to protect themselves from attacks that are coming from a region that are within the U.S. policy of where they can operate our weapons, our systems, our capabilities. I'd refer you to the Ukrainians to speak to their own operations.
Ukraine said it carried out a drone strike on a military airfield in Russia's western region. Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden will make their first trip together since the president's decision to drop out of the presidential race. Biden will appear alongside Harris at an event in Maryland next week, August 15th. The White House says they'll be talking about progress making to lower costs for the American people. Summer Games in Paris will be wrapping up this weekend. The U.S. right now leading with the number of medals at 105. China has 77, France has 55. China has the most gold medals with 32. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 index is advancing. The S&P set for its best two-day run in 2024. We are seeing a late week comeback for stocks. Right now, we have got the S&P 500 index climbing by 19 points, up by about 0.4%. The Dow, however, swinging between gains and losses, back in the red. Little change, down 3 points, while NASDAQ is higher by 71 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, up now by about 0.4%. 10-year at 3.94%, with the 2-year yielding 4.05%. Gold up $1 the ounce to $24.28. Little change there. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.6%, 76.63 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin building on yesterday's surge. Bitcoin up another 1.2% right now at 60,230. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren is asking Tesla's board to investigate whether CEO Elon Musk is using the electric vehicle's resources to benefit other companies that he owns and runs. Tesla shares today, they're up by 0.7%. Recapping, stocks are trading mixed. S&P up 19, up by about 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. So we talked about this a lot during Open Interest this morning on Bloomberg Television about shares of TSMC. They were out of the gate, well, they were up about 1%, up 2% at their highs, but it did seem like their pre-market, they were going to rally even more.
Right, and that's because their revenue in July was up, what, 45%?
45%, yeah,
so,
exactly.
They were doing well, and this is a foundry that's key to the AI arms race, right? Because not everybody realizes NVIDIA doesn't make its own chips.
No.
They send the plans to Taiwan Semiconductor, and Taiwan Semiconductor makes those chips.
Right, they're a contract chip maker, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so let's get to it. And I am curious, though, what Ian King has to say about what we did get from TSMC overnight. Ian, of course, Bloomberg News, U.S. Semiconductor and Networking reporter, back with us in our San Francisco bureau. Hey, Ian, good to wrap up the week with you. What we got from TSMC, it looked like pretty tremendous growth. What does it tell us about the outlook? And I always think about, so if it's good for TSMC, does it mean everybody or a lot of the semi space is doing okay?
Yeah, I mean, the monthly reports are obviously a fairly general number. We don't get the drill down that would give us more insight. I think the way it's been taken, though, there are a couple of things to point out. As Matt said, 45%, that's not bad. But up from last year, where things were relatively weak, particularly the smartphone market, and you've got to remember that Qualcomm and Apple are really big customers of TSMC. But the other way to look at it is, I think you've pointed to, which is everybody is very nervous about this massive spend that we've seen on AI infrastructure. Will the big spenders keep going? And will the beneficiaries, notably NVIDIA, continue to keep benefiting? And this number would appear to be a positive sign for that particular concern.
I wondered when I was looking at this and thinking about it, you focus on this all the time, but for me, it's just cursory like 10 minutes every hour. They make all of their chips in Taiwan. Like, if something bad were to happen between China and Taiwan, would the world be stuck with no more semiconductor production?
So you're right, all roads lead to Hsinchu. This company is tremendously important and now accounts for a large percentage of the world's most advanced semiconductors are produced in a couple of sites it has in Taiwan, but it also has a plant that it's bringing up in Japan. It also has one that it's building near Phoenix. So there is an effort to diversify, that supply chain. Also, Samsung, the South Korean manufacturer, it's kind of nearest rival. So that has advanced capacity in South Korea, and they're also building, another plant near Austin, Texas. And then Intel is trying to get back in the game. So it would be a disaster. It would have significant consequences on the world economy, but there are efforts to diversify that risk.
I spoke with bankers, Carol and I both, with bankers from Ohio yesterday, and Intel is investing, planning to invest tens of billions of dollars to build a factory there, but they have been teetering lately. In fact, Intel, I think, the second biggest loser on the S&P today. Is it set in stone, or is it possible that they may not be able to go forward with all of their foundry building plans?
I mean, our colleague Mackenzie Hawkins did a kind of a good roundup of the CHIPS Act funding efforts so far. And, you know, the key part of this, and I think the thing that we should all pay attention to, and particularly as taxpayers in the US, is the way this has been structured is you don't get money unless you actually do what you said you're going to do. So, yeah, you can throw up a building and we'll give you a certain amount of support for that. But at the same time, if you don't put the much more important equipment in that building and actually start sort of producing chips, then you don't get the rest of that money. So, you know, government support is contingent upon a knowledge of the way that the chip industry has always worked, which is, hey, we'll build these shells and we'll hope that we get the demand, but then we'll only really put the expensive equipment in there if we're absolutely sure that we need to go ahead with expanding capacity.
I just wanted to ask because last night after you and I left this studio, Moody's downgraded Intel's senior unsecured debt rating to BBB from AAA, and Moody's said the downgrading reflects our expectations of Intel's significantly weaker profit over the next 12 to 18 months, resulting from a combination of higher costs related to product manufacturing, process technology transitions, unfavorable product mix, weaker than expected demand in nearly all of its product segments, and continued market share losses.
It's not good. Well, and I feel like, you know, Ian, come on in on this, because I also feel like when they were, you know, came out, they talked about in their press release, which it struck us all weird, where they were talking, I felt like, was it liquidity and cash flow, you know, concerns? It just isn't something you expect from an Intel.
I mean, this time a week ago, we were kind of bracing for impact, and that impact landed, and it landed more heavily than I think even the most pessimistic people out there. Some analysts like Stacey Rasgon from Bernstein said, look, if Intel wasn't getting government money, if it wasn't getting outside financing, this would be a going concern consideration. And this is absolutely astounding for a company of this nature.
Unbelievable.
Doesn't it, like, you think about how, you know, you've covered this space a long time. Like, to be talking about that is pretty wild, right?
I mean, I was looking at the numbers before I came here to talk to you guys. You know, it's going to be less than half the size of NVIDIA in terms of revenue. AMD, a company that struggled to even get on the map for years, is now up to over 50% of Intel's revenue. So that top line, that, you know, that really important amount of money that was flowing in, that fired up all of this R&D, all of this building of new plants, it's just nowhere near where it used to be. Profitability has gone away. The cash flow is obviously struggling. They're not paying a dividend anymore. I mean, all of these things are not good signs. Their answer to this is like, look, we're taking the pain up front. We're investing heavily. You know, we're paying for the mistakes of the past. But don't worry, we're on the way back. I think what the market wants to see now is evidence that points to that being absolutely the case. They want to see a bottom. They want to see a turning point. We don't really have any numbers that would indicate that that's the case at this particular moment.
Just so we don't end on such a dour note, I woke up this morning to read Carmen Reineke's story. NVIDIA has lost almost $1 trillion of market cap in the last couple of weeks, which is nuts. But
still up 112% this year.
Well, that is true. And I was also going to say, like, there's still a ton of investment in AI. Like, the story hasn't changed because the Bank of Japan raised rates and the non-farm payrolls number came in low, right?
Absolutely not. We have had no evidence from this earnings season in particular that there's any slowing in the sort of wild rush to put all of this infrastructure in place. And obviously, NVIDIA is the main beneficiary of that. So we'll find out later this month what NVIDIA has to say themselves. But at the moment, there's no reason to be concerned about the fundamentals. The valuation of NVIDIA, that's another story, right? That's up to investors to put the appropriate value on it. But the fundamentals at this point appear to be solid.
pretty wild space, though. Ian, thank you so much. Really super, and always appreciate what he has to say. Ian King, he is U.S. Semiconductor Networking reporter. Ian, have a great weekend. Of course, here at Bloomberg News, out there in our San Francisco bureau. It is kind of fascinating,
It is.
right?
I mean, there are times. I started out as a cub reporter like 25 years ago, covering Infineon in Munich, and I thought, what a boring space this is.
Not boring
and
at all.
And it is not boring at all.
All right, coming up, everybody. Flights, hotels, and parks all flashing travel warning signs. Why is Expedia up then?
Connection lost.
Plans to eliminate as many as 2,450 hourly positions at a pickup truck factory located near Detroit, Warren, Michigan. Right now, Stellantis shares they are. Reuters says the number of people affected could be similar to or slightly higher than the 4,000 employees that Cisco laid off in February. Those cuts, according to Reuters, are likely to be announced as early as Wednesday. Again, Cisco trading lower today, down by 0.4%. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing's revenue rose 45% in July, accelerating its pace of growth from the June quarter and bolstering hopes for sustained strong demand for artificial intelligence chips from the likes of NVIDIA. Right now, we've got shares of Taiwan Semi up by 1.2%. NVIDIA lower today by 0.2%. What a move in shares of Sweet Green today. The salad chain, they are surging after it posted sales that outpaced market expectations. It also raised its outlook for the full year. The stock is value this year through yesterday's close versus a 2.8% gain for the Russell 2000 index. Shares of Sweet Green, they are surging today. We've got Sweet Green right now up by 30.1%. And Expedia posted better than expected second quarter results. Expedia shares today, we are looking at Expedia up by 9%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, we're going to get back to Bloomberg Business Week in just a moment. Carol Massar along with Matt Miller in for Tim Stenivek. Right now, though, back to D.C. we go and a check on world and national news. Let's head on over to Amy Morris. Amy.
All right, thanks, Carol. Russia declaring a federal-level emergency in Kursk following a large-scale incursion from Ukraine, sending out reinforcements today, 4 days after hundreds of Ukrainian troops poured across the border in what appeared to be Kyiv's biggest attack on Russian soil since the war started. Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
We are supportive of Ukraine and their success on the battlefield, but as the dynamics have shifted on the battlefield, they've been able to actually push the Russians back further into Russian territory. But as they see attacks coming across the border, they have to be able to have the capabilities to respond.
Ukraine said it carried out a drone strike on a military airfield in Russia's western region, expanding the reach of its assaults on Russian territory for a fourth day. Tropical Depression Debbie is on track to hit the Northeast, including the New York tri-state area. Debbie was downgraded from a tropical storm this morning. More than 40 million people are under flood alerts from South Carolina to Vermont. More than 26 million people are under a tornado watch from Virginia to Delaware. The death toll from Debbie is now up to 7. Summer Games in Paris are going to wrap up this weekend. Right now, the U.S. leads with the number of medals at 105. China has 77 and France has 55. China has the most gold medals with 32. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Matt Miller.
Thank you so much, Amy Morris, there in our D.C. bureau. We want to get to a story that actually just popped up among the most read. I think it is the most read on the Bloomberg in the past 60...
Depends how you store it, right? I default to 8 hours, but you're looking at 1 hour.
I like to go back and forth here, but it's the second most read in the past 60 minutes and has to do with something we've been talking a lot about, is what's going on with the consumer and travel.
Yeah, all of the earnings that we've seen coming in from companies like TripAdvisor, like Airbnb, like Disney in terms of their parks.
Yeah.
Point to a consumer that is just pulling back from bookings. I mean, it's not a surprise because after the pandemic, you had the revenge travel, and a lot of people really jumped back into it. So there's going to be, a reversion to the mean after that. But
so this is what I've been thinking about. Again, we're still kind of righting the ship post-pandemic. So is this just more normal? And obviously the surge and the revenge travel was abnormal.
I would say so. But, as Ian pointed out, that's one thing to look at the fundamentals, and then it's another thing to price the companies. So many of these companies were punished.
Yeah.
We saw, for example, Airbnb get spanked.
Right.
But Expedia...
What is up with that?
It's up 10% today.
I know.
And I looked back to see, if you look at a stock, XPEE, I think is the ticker, right? If you look at a stock and you do HCP space W,
right,
you can see how it's done for the week. Because I thought, okay, maybe Expedia got spanked on, Wednesday or Thursday, but it didn't. It's done well all week. It's up 12% week to date.
Right. So it's interesting, right?
It was down 7% last week, but that follows a 10% gain the previous 2 weeks.
And
so
Expedia's
done pretty well.
About soft demand as well. It did do post an earnings beat, but nonetheless, a soft demand. What was it we were talking earlier about, looking for, is it Airbnb that they're trying to diversify in terms of look for other avenues of growth?
Other kinds of businesses.
So that's,
and a company like TripAdvisor does have diversification, right? You don't just buy planes there. You don't plane tickets. You can't buy planes on TripAdvisor. You don't just get hotel rooms.
Yet.
You don't just rent cars. It's any of those things.
Right.
So if one of them is, ebbing, the others can flow. The problem with an Airbnb is they don't have that diversification.
All right, don't go anywhere. We're not going to go anywhere. Although, if you're watching on TV, the close is coming your way in just a moment. Matt and I are going to continue on Bloomberg Business Week. We're talking a little bit more about the markets and also, just stick around, you'll find out.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just 60 minutes away from the closing bell, getting ready to wrap up the trading day, the trading week. We're looking at stocks. Yeah, they're in the green across the board, but kind of small moves here.
Well, there are some bigger moves under the hood, and two of the smartest young reporters at Bloomberg just walked in here.
Don't go to them yet.
I'm just excited.
You can tease them, but don't go to them
I'm
yet.
getting a call from Mark Berniker.
Okay, put the phone down. All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master, along with Matt Miller, in for Tim Stenovic. Coming up, we're going to get to two of our brightest. Don't tell anybody else. And get to our stock and bond and eco roundtable in just a moment. And then plus from New York to Denver, U.S. cities are seeking migrants for jobs.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about immigrants who have federal working visas, so have been given the
there's caveats,
the permission to work here, and restaurants that can't find anybody to staff their kitchens at the wages that they're willing to pay, which I think is a key.
That's going to unpack
piece
this one.
of the equation.
Also, we've got the CEO at Pagaya on earnings and AI in the fintech space. David Weston's going to be along to talk about Wall Street Week, and then ready-to-drink cocktails, which I know you will not partake in.
Yesterday was the. Yesterday marked my 2-year anniversary.
So Matt will not be having a cocktail.
I have not gotten hammered in 2 years.
Well, the last time you came on, or a while ago,
I've had a couple sips.
I know.
Like I had because you pushed me.
I didn't push. I never push. I'm not.
Peer pressure on this program.
Never, never. All right, we've got a lot coming up over the next 2 hours. First up, though, back to the trade here and Charlie Pellet.
All right, I thank you very much. 59 minutes to go until that closing bell clangs on Wall Street. Higher across the board right now. Been a choppy session for the Dow, swinging between gains and losses, but right now we are looking at a 9-point advance on the Dow. Little change, though. That's the key takeaway, up just under 0.1%. S&P up 17 right now, up by about 0.3. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 54, up 0.3%, while the Nasdaq 100 Index higher by 0.4%. The 10-year at 3.94%, the 2-year 4.05%. Gold just about flat on the day, 24.28 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 0.7%, 76.76 for a barrel of WTI. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers is warning against incorporating any presidential sway over the setting of U.S. monetary policy, saying it would only end up damaging the economy over time.
The skills associated with being an economic forecaster and the skills associated with being a successful real estate operator are very, very different ones. So I don't think there's any particular reason to think that a president of the United States would have a intellectual contribution to make.
Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. You can hear more of the conversation tonight on Wall Street Week with David Weston, 6 o'clock Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and Television. Cisco cutting thousands of jobs in a second round of layoffs this year, according to Reuters, citing sources. Cisco right now down 0.5%. Again, recapping the Dow just turning negative, swinging between gains and losses. S&P holding on to a gain of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I wish we had $1 for every time we said stocks ending the week with a whimper.
You mean today?
Yeah,
Because I
today.
haven't said that very often
No,
lately.
today. But
Yeah.
today we said it like a million times.
I mean, somebody said today, like, slow news day, it's the summer, but this is the first slow news day we've had
I agree.
all summer long.
It's been crazy, right? And we did have, the biggest rally in 2 years this week.
Yeah.
With the S&P having a
yesterday.
very different, right?
That was
I know.
yesterday.
I know. It's like this has felt like a month this week. All right, let's get to it because we really did feel like we needed to kind of wrap up the week that was. With us is Bloomberg Business Week. Well, I shouldn't say Bloomberg Business Week. Maybe
Bloomberg Economics.
Thank you. You want to help? You want to do this for me?
Well, I don't know his official title. Dude, what's your official title?
U.S. Economist.
U.S.
Bloomberg
Economist,
Economics.
Stuart Paul from Bloomberg Economics, and Jess Menton, who runs the stocks desk for us at BN.
Bloomberg News Deputy Team Leader.
Yeah.
For equities, U.S. equities.
That's right.
Yeah, usually wearing green, like almost literally
I
every
know.
day
This is
she
the
wears
first
green.
time I think I've worn black.
And I know
in
that-
a couple
Do you have
of
a
years.
green thing?
I was born in May, so emerald is my favorite color.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
green's my
you
favorite
didn't know,
color.
you hadn't noticed that?
I didn't want.
Paul Sweeney
She
and
wears-
Matt Miller give me
You
a
wear
hard
a
time.
lot of bright colors,
I
which
do.
which is kind
I do. I like to bring the sunshine.
You do.
How has this week been for you, by the way? Because
Oh, it's been great. I love weeks like
Like
this.
Sunday night, were
This
you
is our time to
freaking out?
shine on the equities team. No.
When you went to bed and saw that the Nikkei was down 12%,
He was like, here we go. It's going to be a great
You were
week.
freaking out Monday.
I was kind of freaking out, and it really reminded me of Carol and I were on the desk together during the great financial crisis, and it really kind of reminded me of that. I was wondering, was there a fat finger trade maybe, or flash crash kind of thing?
Well, I think based on my conversations with sources, I knew it wasn't going to be something like that, and it was a lot more technical because I know.
Did they say that right from the get-go?
Exactly, because that sell-off started way before that, and even way before last Friday's employment report. It started the next day after the Fed's decision, because we had that huge rally that Wednesday on July 31st when Powell spoke, and a lot of people speaking to me thought it was going to be kind of a sell the news type of moment, because you had things like small caps that were on a tremendous tear in July. If you looked at the Russell 2000 relative to the S&P 500, one of its best performances on a monthly basis probably in history of the index. And so those were more speculative corners of the market that were taking off, that were getting well ahead of themselves. And then if you looked at the flows data, especially from Bloomberg Intelligence, actually a lot of the money was flowing into more of those income-driven corners of the market that benefit from rate cuts if you're looking at utilities and also real estate.
But that was, as you say, technical, or that was about positioning, right? That was about the carry trade, because the Bank of Japan raised rates on Wednesday, and then the Fed said, we're going to start cutting. Stuart, a lot of people started freaking out a couple days later when they saw the non-farm payrolls number. I was sitting on a beach on the Mediterranean looking at my Bloomberg, and I thought, the number's bad, but it's not that bad. Katie Greifeld's like, oh my God, they're going to start pricing in 50 basis point cuts. And then people were starting to call for 75 basis point cuts, but we knew the labor market was softening. It's not a huge surprise, right?
That's right. So everybody's known that the underlying fundamentals of the labor market have indicated some sort of softening. It is a bit surprising, though, to see the unemployment rate rise to 4.3%. I think that that's what caught everybody else off guard. I think that everybody takes the non-farm payrolls number, so 114,000 jobs added, with a sufficiently large grain of salt that the decline, the month-on-month decline in the pace of hiring, isn't really what drove everything.
Well, and the margin of error on that NFP number is like 200,000, right? So
the margin of error is huge.
Yeah.
The subsequent revisions are always huge. But the discussion about the SOM rule being triggered by the unemployment rate rising to 4.3% is enough to get people concerned, especially when it was brought up during the press conference.
We should explain that just quickly. The SOM rule.
Ahead.
So the SOM rule is, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you have the 3-month average of unemployment rise by more than 50 basis points, so more than 0.5%, then we're in a recession. And if you look, I graphed it back to 1950. It's been right every single time. Without fail, when the 3-month average rate of unemployment rises 50 basis points, we have been in what the NBER classified as a recession. This time is different?
So even Claudia would say perhaps this time is different. Claudia Sahm is the originator of the SOM rule.
She now wishes it was called something else.
She went to Denison,
right?
By the way. Denison University.
Anyway, go ahead.
That's right. So it is something that happens, as Chairman Powell said, with a pretty considerable statistical regularity. There isn't a great theoretical explanation for why it should be the case, other than the idea that when the unemployment rate starts rising rapidly, folks start getting a little bit scared. They start reining in their spending. If people are reining in their spending, firms start hiring at a much slower pace, even as the labor force is expanding at the same pace. So you might not see layoffs, you might not see dramatic layoffs, but you could see an accelerating unemployment rate. And that's the sort of thing that gets to be a little bit scary. So that's what the SOM rule warns of. It is possible that this time could be different if, for example, the uptick in the unemployment rate in July was driven by temporary layoffs, which is actually what we saw. And if those temporary layoffs end up staying temporary and those workers end up finding new employment quickly. So I think that it's still a little bit too early to say case closed, but it is the sort of thing that starts getting your monitors flashing red as opposed to just amber.
Jess,
go ahead.
I thought bad news, though, was good news, right? Because bad labor number, which means the Fed, who's already taken care of inflation, right, is going to start cutting. And the stock market loves it when the Federal Reserve cuts rates, right?
Well, not necessarily. It depends on because if you go back to early 2001, there were emergency rate cuts, and the stock market hated that because that would signal that the economy is much weaker than people were anticipating, and markets didn't bottom once the Fed was stopped cutting rates. It actually bottomed when earnings growth potential and the contraction that we saw actually bottomed. But to the point with the SOM rule, another indicator that was a part of that is actually looking at immigration, because that's part of it too, because they have a higher labor force participation rates overall. So that's part of it that people have talked about as well, that has impacted that and kind of made it a bit of a conundrum of how much and how well does it work this time around.
It's a deep tease for our next segment.
It is really, actually, it's kind of perfect. I know. So, all right, so here we are on a Friday, and it just does feel like things have calmed down, but I am thinking already about the next jobs report. I'm thinking about the inflation reads, next week. Stuart, could everything start to change again, the narrative change again?
I wouldn't be surprised to see the narrative change once again next week. Next week, we're going to get both producer prices and consumer prices. Both are expected to show a 0.2% month-on-month change. That'll be enough to allow annual CPI to come down a little bit, just a touch below 3% for the first time in a long time. What's going to really matter most is the composition of CPI and PPI, because those are the components that map into the Fed's preferred measure, the core PCE index. What's a little bit funny is that, so these are numbers from July, and one of the items that comes from the producer price index is the cost of financial services that are provided to consumers, like portfolio management services, for example. Now, Jess will tell you, stock prices were still rising through most of July. It wasn't until the BOJ decided to hike rates after the Fed
So
decision.
could we see?
So we could end up seeing exactly portfolio management services feeding into core PCE inflation in a way that ends up boosting the annual measure. And so exactly, we could see the narrative change pretty dramatically on even tame
So you have to
headline
be smart
readings.
about reading what goes into it.
You can read our research.
Back to, listen, we had just the pause that refreshes, right? We had basically a correction, near as damn it to it, on the S&P. We've erased $900 billion from NVIDIA's market cap since the high in June. And yet, we're back to the labor market slowly weakening, the Fed is going to cut, and earnings are better than had been expected. Like, if you were bowled up 2 weeks ago, you should be bowled up now, right?
And that's when you saw the SOX actually yesterday, that tracks